Hear all these stories anywhere you listen to podcasts on the Let's Read podcast. When I was 9 years old, I came home from school one day to find my mom and my grandpa sitting at the kitchen table. They'd been waiting to give me some bad news, and that bad news was that my dad was missing. He and my Uncle Lee had gone off on a weekend hunting trip and were about half a mile into the woods east of Coretta when Dad realized that he'd left his grunter in his truck. And a grunter is basically just sort of a duck whistle, but it sounds like a buck's grunt, and after telling Uncle Lee to wait where he was, Dad walked back to his truck, never to be seen again. Uncle Lee said that he waited about 20 to 30 minutes before he started to get worried, and then he made his way back to the truck. But my dad was nowhere to be found, and by nightfall, Uncle Lee had every deputy from the McDowell County Sheriff's up in those hills trying to find my dad. And the search effort lasted about 2 weeks, but after failing to find a single trace of him, the county sheriff called it off. Mom kept his name on the missing persons register for a long time, while the whole family and all of his friends pitched in to hire a private investigator. The guy was a retired police officer from Charleston, a good one too, but in the end, there was only one thing that he could tell my mom and grandpa that they hadn't already heard from the county sheriff. The most likely explanation was that, for some reason, Dad had walked through the woods until he came to a series of old mining pits near a town called Cucumber. And then, as their theory goes, Dad walked into one of those mines, fell down a shaft, and his body had been laying in the bottom ever since. Yet during that initial search and rescue attempt, every mine shaft that could be safely explored had been mapped out by a team of caving specialists. And the tunnels that weren't safe had teams of cadaver dog handlers dispatched to them. Dad's body wasn't found in any of them, though. That didn't mean that it wasn't there. The sheriff couldn't rule that out entirely, but there was something that he neglected to mention that Mom later found from the PI that she hired. There was graffiti in one of the mine shafts. The private investigator said he didn't recognize any of the symbols or words, but they'd been crudely daubed in a sort of spray paint about midway through one of the tunnels, so he could only assume that the place was a hangout for local teens. And that's what led him to believe that the kids who'd tagged those tunnels might also know what happened to my dad. And despite his best efforts, he couldn't locate any of them. Uncle Lee tried to help as best he could and kept in close contact with the private investigator, but he took Dad's disappearance harder than anyone. Everyone kept telling him that it wasn't his fault, that there was no way that he could have known and that he did all the right things. But he was never quite the same after Dad disappeared, and no one could blame him. I didn't get the full story of what had happened until I was much older, but between the day he went missing and the day Mom had him declared legally deceased, there was a lot of hope and a lot of heartbreak. Having my sister and I asking when is Daddy coming home almost drove Mom crazy with grief. But as we got older and we accepted that he was never coming back, it got more and more easy to deal with until it just kind of faded into the background. Dad's disappearance was behind us, but it was still there. It was always there, really. By the time I was 22, my sister had moved over to Morgantown for college, and I was working full-time at a fixin' shop in Welsh, and I hadn't seen Uncle Lee in maybe 4 or 5 years by that point. He sent us birthday and holiday messages and would occasionally call Mom around the anniversary of Dad's disappearance, but other than that, he kept himself very distant. At least until the day when Mom said that he'd called and had asked to talk to me. I was more than happy to see him for the first time in years, and I understood why Uncle Lee had kept his distance. He once told my mom that I reminded him of a younger version of my dad, and while some of those memories brought him a lot of joy, they brought him a lot of pain too. And because of that, I thought I wouldn't see much of Uncle Lee anymore, and That brought me quite a bit of pain as well. And so you can imagine how happy I was when I'd heard that he wanted to meet up. I drove over to his place out near Filbert one Saturday around midday, and what followed was what I can only describe as a two-person family reunion. We were both happy to see each other, and after spending all morning worrying that he'd be some depressive alcoholic, it was a huge relief to see him very clear-eyed and on his feet. As we caught up, we shared some cold cuts and chow, along with a cold beer, and the conversation sort of meandered around the subject of my dad until there was no avoiding him anymore. We talked about this and that, things he used to do and how much we missed him. And then out of nowhere, Uncle Lee had a proposal for me. He asked if I wanted to visit the site of my dad's disappearance, suggesting that it might provide a degree of closure. He said that he'd been up in those hills east of Coretta about half a dozen times, and even though he'd never found so much as a trace of my dad, it helped alleviate the feeling of uselessness that had plagued him ever since. And at first it didn't sound like such a hot idea. I could appreciate why walking those hills helped Uncle Lee deal with the pain and loss, but to me, meandering around the area my dad vanished from sounded like slow torture. I was just happy to be in touch with my uncle again, someone I could actually build a relationship with, because after my grandpa died, he was the only paternal figure I had left. Focusing on my dad like that, in a negative way I mean, I couldn't see the benefit. Yet slowly but surely, over the course of about a year or so, I came around to the idea that this might provide some much-needed closure. I'd been visiting Uncle Lee every couple of weeks between the time we first got in touch and the day that I suggested that we drive up into the hills east of Coretta, and then hike out to the place that he last saw my dad. He was happy to hear that I'd changed my mind, but it was very muted, for lack of a better word. Kind of like he didn't want to show the emotion of how much it meant to him, because he was worried that it'd scare me off. He didn't ask what had changed my mind, but if he did, I'd have told him that it came down to something as simple as this. If I started feeling too emotional, negatively emotional I mean, we could always just turn around, walk back to my truck, and drive home. Nothing was keeping me there, and if walking those woods didn't provide any good feeling, at least I'd be able to say that I tried. Uncle Lee and I arranged to drive down to Coretta together on a Saturday morning in early May. To my relief, we'd somewhat shifted the focus away from my dad's disappearance and began treating it like a regular old hike through the woods. We'd uphold our long-standing tradition and take along a few beers and some cold cuts, and then if at any point I felt like talking about him or asking questions about my father, then we could cross that bridge once we came to it. I'll admit to feeling a little anxious as we drove alongside the creek and got closer to the back road we were good to park my truck on. But by the time we got to walking and talking, I realized that patch of woods was no different than any other in West Virginia. I'd always considered that area around Coretta to be haunted. Not literally, of course, but it might as well have been like the ghost of my dad was wandering those hills. I never wanted to go there as long as I lived, so to suddenly be there one day and realizing it was mostly all in my head, it was definitely good for me. But the word mostly is kind of carrying a lot of the weight in that sentence. And as much as it felt regular as anything to be walking through those woods with my Uncle Lee, it was like there was still a piece of my dad out there, hiding away someplace. Call it a memory, call it hope, but there was something, and I could feel it. And we kept on walking and talking till we got to Big Creek, and then after making ourselves comfortable on a flat rock at the edge of the creek, we had ourselves a little break. And I figured that marked the halfway point of our hike, so when we were done, I suggested that we head back towards my truck. But Uncle Lee had another idea. He said that there was something he wanted to show me. And then after another mile or so of walking, we came to a rocky outcropping which overlooked the abandoned mines that I told you about earlier. I asked him if that was the place the private investigator had checked out all those years before, and Uncle Lee said it was. And then after a sigh, he said that there was something he'd never told me and my mom. He told the sheriff all right, and he told the PI too. He just never had the heart to tell me or Mom that the last time he'd seen my dad had been when he was walking in to one of those mine shafts. So between noticing my dad was missing and informing the authorities, Uncle Lee said that he'd run all over the woods calling out Dad's name and trying to find him before the situation got serious. Uncle Lee said that he was never much of a tracker. He simply got lucky in heading in the right direction. He didn't think my dad had walked in the direction of those mines, but when he stood in that exact same spot that we were stood in, he saw a distant figure dressed exactly like my dad walking into one of the dark, derelict tunnels. Uncle Lee said that he scrambled down the steep incline of the outcrop and then ran off in the direction of the mine shaft that he'd seen my dad walk into. But when he got there and walked inside with his flashlight in hand, there was no one there. When I asked Uncle Lee if he'd seen the same weird graffiti as the PI did, he said no, but that there was something about that old mine shaft that made him feel very uneasy. According to Uncle Lee, that's what had truly been haunting him for all these years. The idea that he'd seen his brother walk into a dark tunnel, then upon hearing his name being called had chosen to hide in the dark, pretending not to hear. And to him, that was the best case scenario. The worst case was that something had happened to him in that old mine, something terrible that meant that he couldn't walk or talk anymore, even if he wanted to. I understood why such information had been withheld from me. The situation was bad enough, without piling more unsettling mystery on top of it, but still, I told Uncle Lee that I was glad that he'd shared the whole truth with me, even if it was as disturbing as it was painful. And I figured after that it was time to leave, but Uncle Lee had another proposal for me, and one that I found impossible to turn down. He asked if I wanted to walk down to the mine with him, as it was something he himself did every so often as part of his attempt to exorcise that area of the hills. And by that point, I couldn't think of a reason why we shouldn't. We'd already walked all that way, and I had no idea if or when I'd return. And so not heading down to that mine seemed like it'd be a wasted opportunity, and if it worked for Lee in dispelling some of the heartache, then it might just work for me too. And so I agreed, and off we went. Heading down the steep face of the outcrop was definitely not a smart move, so we walked around the edge of the mining pit a little bit to find a safer way down. At the bottom, all kinds of warning signs had been hammered into the dirt telling people to keep out, and that they'd be seriously injured if they tried exploring any of the old tunnels. I asked Uncle Lee if he thought that my dad had fallen down a mine shaft or had been the victim of a freak cave-in that had left him unable to respond to his cries. He didn't know for certain, but if that was the case, Dad's body would have been found a long time ago. Whatever happened to him, it happened in that old mine. It just hadn't been properly explained yet. As we got closer and closer to the mine's entrance, which appeared as a jagged scar in the rock, it was like the air itself grew heavier. Very little light was making its way down the tunnel, but I remember seeing splintered wooden beams jutting out at odd angles like broken teeth in the mouth of some great serpent. Neither myself nor Uncle Lee said a word as we approached the entrance, and the place was so quiet that the sound of our boots crunching into the gravel and slate seemed unnaturally loud. I started to see things like discarded tools, a cracked lantern, a coil of frayed rope half buried in the dirt. Things which suggested the mine had been abandoned in a hurry rather than in an organized or phased fashion. I asked Uncle Lee if he knew why the place had been abandoned in the first place, and he said that he'd heard rumors of flooding, but didn't know for certain if they were true or not. The official explanation was that the company had simply gone out of business. But if that was true, why did the place look like it had been abandoned so hastily? And as we got within just a few feet of the mine's entrance, it was like the temperature dropped by a few degrees, and the darkness in front of me seemed to swallow up all the outside light after just a few feet. I figured Uncle Lee could sense my apprehension, because he started telling me how I didn't have to go inside if I didn't want to. All I had to do was say the word and we could just leave. But like I said, there was no way I was going to just turn around and go home, not after we'd walked all that way. And so, slowly but surely, I started walking toward the entrance and the rusted cage bars of the open gate beyond. I can recall the oddest things from the first few moments. I remember how it got even colder as I stepped into the shaft and how the air had both a smell and taste to it too. Just dust, metal, and mold all rolled into one. The light from outside disappeared quickly, but luckily, I had a tiny flashlight that I kept attached to my keyring, and so after sort of fumbling with it to free it from the ring, I held down the small button and suddenly I could see again. I say I could see again, but not by much. The light from the little keyring attachment was only enough to keep a few feet of darkness at bay, so my pace stayed slow as I tread deeper into the tunnel. I took a few steps and then stopped, then after taking a few more, I turned around to check if Uncle Lee was following me. But when I did, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. Uncle Lee was standing near the cage gate, almost like a total silhouette by then, but there was just enough light for me to see that he held something in his hand. It was something that I knew that he had with him, but something he had no reason to produce in that moment. It was a gun, and the hand that he held it in was shaking. In the microseconds that followed me spotting the gun in his hand, part of me screamed out to reason with him, and there was a brief glimmer of hope when the thought occurred to me that he'd produced that pistol for our own safety. But the way it trembled in his hand, the way he didn't say a single goddamn thing as I turned back to look at him, I got this feeling, sharp as a blade, that I wasn't safe at all. And so I ran. I ran down that tunnel with my tiny, crappy flashlight as the first of Lee's gunshots rang out. The crack split the air behind me, and the bang felt like it exploded my eardrums as I felt the bullet fly past me, all in the same moment. And my adrenaline surged as I realized, to not make myself an easy target, I had to turn my flashlight off. Then as I eased my thumb off that button, I was just plunged into darkness. I'd never been so scared in my entire life. I didn't know it was even possible to feel that level of terror. The only light came from Uncle Lee's shots as my lungs burned and my muscles began to scream. And any second I expected to either take a bullet or slam into a complete wall. As it turned out, I was headed for a wall, and the only thing that alerted me was seeing one of Lee's bullets ricochet off something metallic. I flicked on my flashlight for a second and saw the tunnel diverting into 3 different directions, and I picked a path in a split second and then kept running. And only then I was out of Lee's sight that I could switch that little flashlight back on and start looking for a place to hide. As I ran into the diverting tunnel, the weak glow of the flashlight in my hand started to bounce off the much narrower walls, and I suddenly realized something had been written on them. At first I thought it was the graffiti the private investigator had mentioned, but even while running at full speed, I saw it was unlike any variety I'd ever seen before. It looked like writing of some kind, smeared in black paint, and an entire section of the tunnel appeared covered in what had to be more than 1,000 lines of it. I didn't even recognize the language, but for reasons you're already aware of, I also didn't have time to stop and study it. What I was really looking for was a place to hide, and I soon found one. Soon after I started to see all that weird script on the walls, I started to see a bunch of smaller and larger chambers leading off from the tunnel that I was running down. I picked one at random, lunged into it, and then tucked into the nearest corner to conceal myself from Lee's flashlight in case he pointed it into the chamber. I kept my breathing shallow, but my heart was hammering against my ribcage, and I quickly realized my hiding place did nothing to dampen my terror. Sure, I was out of Lee's sight, at least temporarily, but more than anything, I realized I was trapped. I remembered how I tried to stay as quiet as possible, but for the first few minutes, which felt like hours, my ears rang non-stop from the tunnel having amplified that sound of Lee's shots. I wondered if my hearing would ever go back to normal, and imagined Lee being able to creep right up on me without me ever being able to hear him. It was almost a relief when I started to hear his voice, along with the sound of crunching gravel as his footsteps got closer and closer. I wasn't deaf, but I was still trapped, so what little relief I felt was quickly drowned out by the raw terror of knowing that I was being hunted. Lee started calling out my name, telling me to come out, not trying to reason with me or make excuses for shooting at me, just telling me that I needed to come out because sooner or later, he was going to find me. I couldn't move. The sound of my footsteps would have almost certainly alerted him to my location, so I had no other choice but to remain in place and stay quiet as possible. That part was surprisingly easy because running all that way, with how unfit I was at the time, meant that I was more than happy to stay still and just catch my breath. When his footsteps got louder still, he suddenly pointed his flashlight down the tunnel my hiding place was at. Staying still and quiet suddenly got a lot harder in that moment. I remember saying it over and over in my head, with my voice being clear as a bell in my mind saying, "Don't come down here. Don't come down here. Please, God, don't let him find me." And I guess God listened because instead of heading down the tunnel that I was in, he just kept on walking. I thought that might be my chance to make a run for it. If Lee was heading deeper into the mine, then maybe I could slip out behind him. But that glimmer of hope was quickly snuffed out when I remembered how loud my own footsteps would be, and how he might not miss all of his shots that time. And he technically had not missed all of his shots. I later found a bullet hole running through one of the flap pockets of my jacket. But like I was saying, I stayed dead still in that dark chamber, keeping my ears tuned for Lee's voice and footsteps. They were still ringing from the shots, and I could hear my heart pulsating into my ears, but it wasn't as bad as it had been previously, and I could hear almost every word Lee was saying as he continued to hunt me down. His footsteps were slow and steady, and occasionally he mumbled something I couldn't quite make out. But then suddenly, his footsteps went from slow and rhythmic to sharp and quick with a scrape of gravel, and then there was silence. It sounded like he suddenly turned around, like he'd heard something that had startled him, and he figured it was me trying to make a break for it. He stayed still for a few moments, a horrible silence hanging in the air, and then he said, "I know you're here, Stanley." And hearing those words terrified me in ways I never thought possible, because Stanley isn't my name. It was my dad's name. It was like my mind was on the verge of fracturing from the combination of terror, confusion, and painful memory. Uncle Lee must have lost his goddamned mind. There was no other explanation for it, and the reality of what that meant for me was almost too much to handle. I wanted more than anything to try and reason with him, to appeal to a sense of kinship. We'd already lost one man in the family. There was no reason to lose another, especially not by his own hand. But I also knew that there was a chance that that gamble would be the last I'd ever take. He'd already tried to kill me, and there was nothing to say that he wouldn't try again. In the end, I resigned myself to just staying put and simply waiting until he came around the corner of my hiding place. I'd rush him and try to get control of that gun. Then whatever happened next, I could only hope for the best. But as I listened to his footsteps become slow and steady again, waiting for them to get louder and louder before I saw his flashlight, we both heard the sound of something else moving in those tunnels. I couldn't tell you who it was. They didn't say a word, and I didn't hear any additional footsteps. All I heard was what sounded like rocks shifting someplace deeper in the tunnels, and then Lee started to speak. I couldn't make out what he was saying at first. He just stopped dead still and then started to mutter something under his breath. I had absolutely zero clue what was going on. I was scared out of my mind, but all I could do was stand there, still as a goddamn statue, and keep my ears tuned like my life depended on it. Because it did. And Lee just carried on muttering to himself, or at least it sounded like he was muttering to himself. And then out of nowhere, I felt this rush of warm air blow through the tunnels, like it was coming from deep down someplace, and it smelled like evil. And when I say that it smelled like evil, I only use that word in place of death. I was about to write it smelled like death, but as someone unfortunate enough to have come across a rotting deer carcass in high summer, it's not the same scent as what I smelled in that mine shaft that day. It wasn't that sort of sick smell of rotten decay that makes you want to either puke or run or both. It was something so foul it shouldn't exist by any natural law. It smelled like burning death. That's the only way I can truly sum it up. Like something that can't exist here on the surface, something older than the mine itself. It had me covering my mouth and nose with my shirt because my first assumption was that it was one of those toxic gases I once read about miners having to worry about. And I remember thinking, so this is why they had to abandon this godforsaken place, as I kept my shirt clamped over my mouth and nose. And then suddenly, I hear Lee begin to yell something. I can't guarantee that these were his exact words, merely by recollection of them, but to my memory he said, "He's here. I brought him. I did what you asked." He repeated himself a lot, said stuff in between like please or you gotta believe me. But he said that first part over and over, in fits and rage, with his screams getting louder and louder until I couldn't make the words out anymore. By the time his yells had degenerated into what sounded like screams of pain and terror, I made a run for it, in the hopes that he was suitably distracted. He wasn't anywhere near the tunnel I was in. I didn't even see his flashlight as I ran, but during the whole time that I was hurtling out of that tunnel at speeds I was sure would end in me falling, I heard Lee's screams. I kept on hearing them as I ran out into the daylight too. They were much fainter and had this eerie, echoey quality about them, but I could still hear them right up until they suddenly went silent. And I didn't look back though. I didn't even consider it. I just kept on running towards the gentler slope we'd used to climb down into that pit. I then scaled it and then carried on running through the woods until my legs screamed out no more. The woods were quiet, but Uncle Lee's screams kept on echoing around in my head, and I was overtaken by these contradictory feelings of trauma and this bizarre sense of victory. I'd made it out, but I couldn't enjoy that feeling because, for whatever reason, Uncle Lee hadn't. When I couldn't run anymore, I began walking back to my truck, and it took a long time before I spotted the glint of its metal bed through a thinning thicket of trees. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle, and then after yanking it open, I slid into the driver's seat and just sort of sat there for a moment, staring at the windshield. I couldn't even process what had just happened to me, and I think I've already said this, I couldn't feel happy that I made it either. Instead, it was just this numb sense of resignation that I had to drive home and report my own attempted murder to the county sheriff, along with a single word: why? I could only manage to drive my truck as far as Coretta before I had to stop. There was no way that I'd be able to drive safely given my condition, and it was the first place available to call the sheriff's department. My hands were still shaking when I asked a motel receptionist if I could use their phone. I could tell that she was a little scared of me on account of my appearance and demeanor, but she let me use their phone all the same. I didn't bother trying to keep the call private. I mean, I lowered my voice, but with a girl right there in front of me, there wasn't much that I could do to keep her from hearing. I told the dispatch lady that my uncle had tried to kill me at the abandoned mining pit north of Cucumber, and how I thought that he'd had some kind of accident and was still inside. And I must have sounded real wigged out and distant, but they understood enough to send help. 2 deputies showed up to the motel in a cruiser maybe 10 to 15 minutes later, and I told them everything. They wrote it all down, then they told me that they'd call me once they checked out the mines. I drove home, took a shower, and tried to process everything that had happened, but there was no processing it. And even after all these years, I still haven't been able to. A few hours later, I got a call from one of the deputies. They'd found footprints and shell casings, but no Uncle Lee. And what followed was the exact same process as what happened after my dad went missing. At least, I imagine it all went down in a similar way. The sheriff got search and rescue involved, who once again explored the mine as deep as it was safe to do so, and there was no sign of Uncle Lee anywhere. No blood, no body, no weapon. Only those shell casings lying near the entrance from where he'd shot at me and I'd run. I told them all about the rush of warm air and how Lee had started to scream, "He's here, I brought him, I did what you asked." And then after many weeks of investigating and consulting with experts, the county sheriff announced their conclusion, and this is what he told us. In mining, there are things called blowouts or gas blowouts. These events involve accidental releases of gases like methane, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, or carbon dioxide, all of which can build up in the mines and prove toxic at certain concentrations. They're caused by things like drilling, blasting, and sudden changes in pressure, and cause poison gases to rush out like tsunamis of toxic vapor. And it's one of those blowouts that the sheriff believed me and my uncle had been caught up in. They explained that in all likelihood, Uncle Lee was hit with a kind of gas cocktail, consisting for the most part of highly concentrated CO2, and this led to a kind of frightened disorientation which ended up causing him to attack me in his confusion. Naturally, given the circumstances, the sheriff told me and Mom that Lee had become the #1 suspect in my dad's disappearance, in which there had almost certainly been some kind of foul play involved. There had been no activity in his bank account after he disappeared, which was probably the #1 reason we all thought that he was gone and hadn't just decided to vanish without a trace. I mean, it was still possible that Dad going missing had nothing to do with what Lee did later, but the sheriff himself said that he was very interested in catching up with Lee so he could find out why he'd called me by my dad's name instead of my own. But more than 2 decades have passed now, and not a trace of Uncle Lee or my dad has ever been found. After the sheriff and his search and rescue people searched the mine, he ordered them all to seal it off with explosives to prevent others suffering the same tragic fate. But their opinion of what Lee's fate was and my own opinion differ greatly. I didn't make a fuss at the time, and I still don't. And what I'm writing now is the first word of objection I've ever committed to paper, let alone voiced out loud. But I don't believe for a second that it was some rush of CO2 that made Uncle Lee start shooting at me. I told the sheriff back then over and over that the rush of warm air didn't happen as we were walking in. It happened as I was hiding, right before Lee started calling out for my dad, saying all that weird stuff and eventually screaming unintelligibly. But the sheriff and his experts acted like I got it all wrong, that I was so disoriented by the fear, the adrenaline, probably a dose of CO2 myself, that I didn't really know what had happened to me. But I do know what happened to me, and I know what happened to my Uncle Lee too. I just don't think I'm ready to actually say it. I also don't think that I'll ever be ready to really say it, because doing so feels like opening the door to some great and terrible darkness. I just know that there's something out there, deep in those mine shafts just north of Cucumber, that's better off left alone. I grew up in small-town Illinois, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business. My sister and I were similar in age. She was 5, I was 7, and we used to play outside together a lot. We lived in a quiet street, so Mom didn't mind us playing in the yard or wandering a little further, so long as we stayed close enough to hear her call us in. Now looking back, I feel like the early 70s were a simpler time. At least to us they were. A time when kids roamed free and nobody thought much of it. Across the street lived a man named Mr. Wroblewski. He was older, maybe in his 50s or 60s, with graying hair and those real thick glasses, the kind that seemed to magnify a person's eyes. He didn't talk much, but he'd wave if we saw him in his yard, messing with his garden or sitting on his porch. And to me and my sister, he was just the guy across the street. Nothing about him stood out as strange, and we didn't have any reason to think otherwise. One summer, Mr. Wroblewski and my mom got to talking, and he offered to take us off her hands for an hour to go get ice creams. The parlor wasn't far, It was just a few blocks over to a little place with a red and white awning where they sold soft serve in cones and little cups with sprinkles. My sister and I loved those parlor trips, and so did our mom. I'm a father myself these days, so I know how great it can be to have even so much as an hour to just relax and recharge. It happened maybe once a week, sometimes more. He'd walk us there, buy us each a cone, and we'd sit on the bench outside the shop, eating while he kept an eye on us. Then, once we were done, he'd walk us back home. He never said much during those trips. He didn't ask us questions or try to get us to talk. He'd just sit there looking around while we ate. I don't recall feeling scared or uncomfortable, and to me it was free ice cream from the nice old man from across the street, and my sister felt the same way. We were kids, and kids don't think too hard about stuff like that. Then one day, Mom told us that we were moving. I remember it happening very suddenly. Mom told us that we were moving to a fun new place, kind of, hyping the whole thing up for us. And then we packed up our things, loaded them into a truck, and just left. I remember the new place was an apartment in a bigger town about an hour away. It had beige carpet and a balcony that we weren't allowed on for obvious reasons, or obvious if you're a parent, I guess. It was a nice apartment, and I didn't understand why we left. Mom didn't explain it. She just said that we were starting over and that was that. But even being 7 years old, I remember wondering why we'd move from a nice house in the suburbs to an apartment in the city. I missed our old house, the yard, the quiet streets, and my sister did too. But we were more concerned about our new schools than the exact reasons for that move. And we ended up moving a second time, and I think maybe a year later, and that time it was back to a rented house in the suburbs. Years went by, and I was in my junior year of high school, when Mom finally told us the truth about why we had moved away from where Mr. Wroblewski used to take us for ice cream. What's crazy is that it was just a regular day, too. We were sitting in the living room, me, my sister, and my mom, when she brought it up out of nowhere. She turned the volume down on the television and asked if we remembered Mr. Wroblewski, the older guy who used to take us for ice cream. Then, when my sister and I said yes, she told us that he was a registered SO. Now, as you can probably guess what the SO means and what it means to be registered for that, my sister and I were horrified. But we also wanted to know absolutely everything Mom had to tell us, including why the hell she had let us go get ice cream with him in the first place. And that's when she got emotional. Because at the time she had no idea that this guy was some freak. You see, back then there was no national database for people like that, and the only state that had one was California. This was also before the cops are duty-bound to inform people that their neighbors are offenders, and way before you could bring this stuff up online and see a whole map of them wherever you are in America. Mom only found out the guy was this after someone in town came over to our house to let us know. Mr. Wroblewski had been smart about those ice cream parlor trips. He always gave us the money and then told us to run ahead and grab our ice cream while he went to the general store across the street. That way, no one saw him directly interacting with us kids. It took a while before people realized what was happening. I don't know how either, but when they did, the town basically sent someone over to the house to warn Mom that we were in danger. She said she freaked out, not just for the obvious reasons either. The lady who came over told her, very boldly too, that the townspeople were planning on murdering Mr. Wroblewski. They just had to come up with a way of doing it that wouldn't attract attention of the police. And the way Mom tells it, the lady basically said something like, "Hey, your kids might have been touched by that guy across the street, but don't worry. We're gonna kill him and make it look like an accident. Have a good day." And that's why it all happened so fast, why she didn't tell us anything. She was scared, not just for our own physical well-being, but for our mental well-being too. She didn't want us anywhere near that guy, and she didn't want us to be anywhere near the house if the townspeople finally dragged him out of his home and lynched him. She said that she asked a couple of probing questions in the weeks afterwards, stuff about him and what he did while walking to and from the ice cream parlor. But since nothing had ever happened to us, none of our answers raised any red flags, and to be honest, Neither me or my sister even remember those kinds of questions being asked. We were that innocent to the whole thing. Hearing it years later hit me hard. I went quiet, my sister went quiet too, and we hadn't seen it coming. To us, he was just the ice cream guy. I don't think he ever did anything to us, and in fact, I'm 99.9% sure that he didn't. I've gone it over in my head 100 times since Mom told us, and not counting any suppressed memories that I'm not even aware of. I have zero memory of Mr. Wroblewski ever, and it makes me shudder just writing this, trying to make a move on us. Those trips to the parlor, the walks there and back, sitting on that bench, nothing stands out as wrong, and my sister says the same thing. She doesn't remember anything weird, but she remembers how distant he was. We were lucky, I guess, but it's horrible to think that we were completely ignorant to who he really was, not to mention the idea of what might have happened if we'd taken a couple more trips to that parlor with him. Mom never let us out of her sight much after that, and she got way stricter and way more protective, but I just figured it was because we were in a new place and a new city and all of that. And I used to wonder if there was any way we could have known, but we didn't even know what all of that was, to be honest, back then. We didn't know to be afraid of a quiet guy who bought us ice cream, and I mean, Mom didn't know either, not at first anyways. Small towns are supposed to be safe. That's what people say, right? They're places that you don't have to lock your car at night. And Mom grew up in the city, so she figured moving to a small town would mean that we were actually safe, but clearly she was wrong. She felt really guilty about it for a long time too, and I could tell. She got this new look whenever the subject came up, like she should have figured it out sooner, and nothing we could say ever really made her feel any better. And a few years back, I looked up that Mr. Wroblewski online. His name was still on the registry. He'd been convicted a few years before we moved into the house across the street, and I could have looked up more details, but I realized that I really didn't want to know them. Just seeing his name on that registry was enough. According to the website, he was still alive and still in that same house. I wondered if he'd tried taking other kids for ice cream after we left. Sometime later, I looked him up again. I'm not even really sure why, but I just did. But when I did, I found his name had been taken off that registry, as according to the site, that only happens if someone provides proof that the person has died. And so I guess Mr. Wroblewski is no longer with us. And it's strange to think about now. That little shop with the red and white awning doesn't feel innocent anymore, and I can still picture it. The sticky cones, the hot pavement under my sneakers, and I can still see him sitting there watching us eat our ice creams. I don't know what he got out of taking us for ice cream. I don't even know why he picked us up either. Maybe he didn't do anything because he couldn't, or maybe he just didn't get the chance. Either way, it's a shadow over those memories. Not a big one, but it's there. My sister and I talk about it sometimes. Not often, but every few years, something reminds us. And we agree that we're lucky. We didn't end up hurt, not physically, but it's still just creepy to think about. Neither of us have been back to that town since we left, and I don't know if the ice cream shop is still there, and I don't think I'd want to see it if it was. It's better left in the past, along with Mr. Wroblewski and his quiet house across the street. My name is Mira, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at UNC Chapel Hill's Department of Anthropology. My research focuses on the intersection of cultural practices and social identity, with an emphasis on ethnographic methodologies and historical contextualization. Or, in plain English, I study how people's traditions and sense of belonging connect by watching them closely and looking at their past. I've undertaken a lot of interesting projects in my time, and while most have been both enriching and satisfying, there's one that I frankly wish that I could forget. And that's not down to the subject matter nor the people that I dealt with, as I cannot speak too highly of either, but rather a very particular encounter with a very particular woman while researching the kinship networks, ritual traditions, and sociocultural resilience of the Melungeon Appalachians. To cut a very, very long story short, the Melungeons are a mixed-race people who inhabit the area where Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina intersect. They're believed to have a blend of European, African, and Native American ancestries with origins tracing back to the late 18th century or earlier. The term Melungeon comes from the French word mélange, meaning mixture, and was applied to those who lived in relative isolation in areas like Hawkins and Hancock counties in Tennessee, Lee County in Virginia, and parts of western North Carolina. The exact origins of the Melungeons remains hotly debated, with theories ranging from shipwrecked Portuguese sailors or lost colony survivors to unions between free peoples of color, European settlers, and indigenous groups like the Cherokee or Saponi Native Americans. Genetic studies, such as those from the Journal of Genetic Genealogy, suggest many Melungeons have roots in sub-Saharan Africa and northern Europe, possibly from early colonial interactions before strict racial laws had been established. Physical traits like dark hair, light eyes, and the so-called Melungeon bump on the head have been observed by researchers, though appearances are known to vary widely. Over time, many Melungeons have assimilated into broader populations, but these days, it's common for their descendants to embrace their ancestry through groups like the Melungeon Heritage Association, who celebrate a complex identity that challenges what has traditionally been rigid racial categories. Undertaking research into the Melungeons seemed like an incredible opportunity, and in anthropology it's rare to get one like that doesn't come with a 14-hour flight and a phrase book. And I was overjoyed to receive the news my proposal had been accepted. But if I'd have known what I was going to encounter, there's no way in hell that I'd ever have honored it. And this is why. I remember driving along this winding Appalachian road, my old sedan rattling over the gravel as I wondered if the old girl was finally going to give up before I made it to my destination. The latest thread that I'd pulled led me to a village called Hollow Ridge, a place that, depending on which one you studied, wasn't even on the map. Some accounts made the rather incredible claim that the town's population manifested an atypical aging process, one that ostensibly deviated from normative physiological expectations. Or to phrase it like the nice lady at the diner I stopped at said, all that good mountain air means folks out there live a heck of a long time. My notebooks were full of dead ends, so I figured that there was no harm in chasing that one too. After hours of driving, Hollow Ridge finally came into view. Clapboard houses sagged against the hillside, smoke curled from chimneys while a few folks lingered on porches watching me roll in. I parked near a general store, grabbed my bag, and stepped out to breathe the air that smelled of damp earth and pine oil. A man in overalls nodded me from across the street, and I quietly nodded back, then headed inside the store. The store clerk, a wiry guy with graying hair, eyed me up with suspicion when I started asking questions about the village. I told him I was a genealogist, tracking Melungeon bloodlines, and he frowned, giving me another look of mistrust and then pointed me toward a direct path leading up the ridge. "Folks up there don't take to outsiders," he said, and then told me, "You better mind yourself." I thanked him, bought a Coke and a pack of gum, and then started walking toward the ridge. The path climbed up steep and cut through thick woods as my boots crunched on leaves and twigs, and it was tough going, but after maybe a mile or so I came to a cluster of houses, smaller and older than the ones below. A woman sat on a porch shelling peas. She looked up, and her eyes were dark and steady as I introduced myself, and I said that I was researching family histories. She didn't smile. She just jerked her head toward the house behind her. "Mama's inside," she told me. "She the one you want to talk to." I stepped up onto the porch, and the door creaked open before I could knock. Two men stood there, both tall with weathered skin and white hair, who looked as if though they might be brothers. They didn't invite me in, and they didn't ask me what I wanted either. They just stared until I took the initiative and explained why I was there. I kept it simple, and then the slightly shorter man who had a scar across his cheek told me, "Mom was 112. She don't talk much. Don't tire her out." The other one nodded, and then they stepped out of the doorway and beckoned me inside. The house smelled of mildew and wood smoke, with a dim living room lit by a single electric lamp. In the corner, lying in a single bed, was a woman, or at least what was left of one. When I say that she was skeletal, I mean that in the very sense of the word. Her skin was stretched so tight over her bones that it looked like the slightest touch would draw blood, and while her eyes were sunk so far deep in their sockets that it made her look nothing short of ghostly. Her hair hung in these thin white strands, and her hands rested like claws by her sides, and her breathing sounded like her windpipe was lined with sandpaper. I'd seen elderly folks before, but she was something else. And as I sat down on a stool one of her sons dragged over for me, she exhibited no reaction to me whatsoever. Not a look, not a word, nothing. I started easy by asking her name. When she didn't respond, one of her sons whispered, "Oneida," from behind me. I then asked where her people came from, and she offered no answer, and her gaze remained locked on the near distance, unblinking. I tried asking about her parents, her childhood, but still got nothing, and her sons hovered nearby, their arms crossed as they watched. "She's weak," one of them eventually said. "Don't push her now." I told them that I understood, but my curiosity burned in my chest, and a 112-year-old who looked like she'd been starving for decades, I had to know more. I leaned forward, keeping my voice soft as I asked her, "Ma'am, how long have you lived for? And how have you lived so long? What's your secret?" For the first time, she seemed to latch onto a word, and after her eyes widened and her lips parted, she turned to me with a look of fear on her face. And then, in a faint, raspy voice that was barely above a whisper, she said, "It eats the years." And the strain of forcing out the words looked like it was killing her. And when she was done, her eyes rolled back and her body jerked weakly as she began to gasp for air. Her sons rushed over, one yelling for me to get out while the other tended to his mother. I grabbed my bag and stumbled outside, heart hammering as the door slammed behind me. And then as I walked back down to the ridgeline, the old woman's words echoed around my skull. What in the world did she mean by, "It eats the years"? I wanted to go back. I wanted that more than anything, to just demand answers. But I knew better than to outstay my welcome in such an isolated place. The woman with the peas was gone, her bowl abandoned as I started down the path with the son's cry of "Don't come back" still ringing in my ears. When I got back to my car, I sat for a while, scribbling down every detail I could. The village felt different now, quieter and heavier, and as I drove off, I found myself checking my rearview mirror much more frequently than usual. That night, I sat in my apartment replaying the day's events over and over in my head. Oneida's face wouldn't leave me, and neither would her words. And I tried to sleep, but the whole encounter just kept replaying in my mind. Then, when I finally did get some sleep, I had the most vivid nightmare where it was me who was lying in that bed, more than a century old, crunching the words, "It eats the years," in the face of some terrified young researcher. And the next morning, I called a research fellow that I happened to be friends with, a folklorist who'd written whole studies on Appalachian myths and legends. I told him about Hollow Ridge, about Oneida and what she'd said to me. And he went quiet for a few seconds, then, after audibly clearing his throat, said that he'd heard a lot of rumors of a village fitting that description. He'd never been able to confirm them because they never came with many details, just old folk tales about pacts with the land. He told me such a find might end up being a great source of pride for me and that he was excited to read my paper when it was finished. I thanked him, but after I hung up, I found myself even more unsettled than before. As the days went by, I found it impossible to think of anything else. Maybe it was the way my friend had hyped me up, but I simply had to know more. And so about a week later, I drove back to that village, parked my car, and then walked down that path again. But when I arrived at the village and walked up the ridgeline to where Oneida's home had been, no one was on the porches and the houses seemed empty. I reached Oneida's family home and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. However, upon finding that door was unlocked, my curiosity got the better of me and I pushed it open. The living room was empty. No lamp, no bed, no Oneida. I checked the other rooms. Nothing. No furniture or signs of life. I walked back outside and called out, but I got nothing but silence. And it was like everyone vanished. And weeks went by. I found myself avoiding my research, but the question still gnawed at me. What had Oneida meant by "it eats the years"? It obviously couldn't be literal, right? It had to be a metaphor, but for what? And why did it look like it scared her so badly? I began digging into my books, cross-referencing Melungeon folklore with anything I could find on Hollow Ridge, but I had no luck. I then engaged with the university's archival resources, including those in the North Carolina collection at Wilson's Special Collections Library, and it was there that I had a small but very significant breakthrough. One night, while elbow-deep in online research, I found an old journal scan dated from the 1700s that detailed a fur trapper's account of what he called Hungry Hollow. The village he described matched Hollow Ridge to a T, and while he didn't provide much detail beyond the description, he stated very clearly that the place's unnatural temperament meant that he'd avoid a return visit no matter the cost. If you'd assumed my encounter with Oneida and her 2 sons failed to make it into my research paper, you'd be correct. I wanted more than anything to get to the bottom of what I'd seen and heard, but with nothing to reference outside of my own personal experience, doing so would have been fruitless at best and detrimental at worst. So instead of falling down a rabbit hole of a rather spurious nature, I decided that the best course of action was to simply try and forget about it. But I can't forget. And no matter how hard I try and rationalize what Oneida said to me, there's still something deeply unsettling about the way she acted while saying it. I wouldn't say that I've spent a lot of time around the elderly or the senile, not as much as other researchers, but I feel capable of distinguishing the confusion and fright of slowly losing one's mind from the very tangible terror associated with things people believe are real. But on that day, and in Oneida's eyes, I saw real emotion and real fear, and I'm in no hurry whatsoever to encounter it again in the near or distant future. When I was in middle school, we had these new neighbors that had moved in next door to us. I remember my mom talking like 2 saints had just moved in because they had 2 adopted kids, and that was seen as a very Christian thing to do. But almost immediately after they moved in, people started realizing how strange they were. One Saturday afternoon, the new neighbor lady came over to our house. I answered the door and she talked to our mom, but I overheard their conversation. The lady said that she wanted to apologize for the noise because her kids were always screaming and crying, and she hoped it wasn't bothering us. I remember being confused because I hadn't heard anyone screaming or crying, and neither had my mom. We'd seen their 2 kids outside sometimes, but they were always very quiet. My mom nodded politely and said something like, "It's no trouble," and then the lady left. We didn't think much of it at the time, It was just odd. But then a few weeks later, everything changed. I remember it was a Sunday and my dad was home working in the garage and I was inside probably messing around with my Atari when he came running into the house. He says something like, "Did you hear that?" But I hadn't heard a thing. He then put on his boots and told me to stay put and then rushed out of the house. I later found out that he'd heard screaming from next door, from our new neighbor's place. And when he got there, he found the lady hysterical, yelling that she'd found her younger kid, the boy, unresponsive on the ground. My dad stayed over there until the cops showed up, and an ambulance came too, but it didn't take long for word to spread through the neighborhood that the little boy had passed away. At first, it seemed like nothing more than some horrible accident. The lady said the kid had fallen and had hit his head very hard on the concrete patio out back. But then the next day, more police showed up, not just the regular ones, but unmarked cars too. They put up yellow tape around the house and started questioning people in the surrounding homes, and suddenly, it didn't seem like such a tragic accident anymore. When someone let it slip that they didn't think the kid had fallen, rumors started flying. People thought the lady had beaten him to death and tried to make it look like an accident. I overheard my parents talking about it that night in the kitchen. Mom was shaken, saying that she couldn't believe something like that happened right across the street from us. My dad just stayed quiet, which was somehow even eerier than hearing my mom all shaken up. The police were in and out of the neighbor's house for days. They came to the news vans and reporters started knocking on the doors asking if we knew anything about the family next door. My parents told me not to talk to them, so I didn't, and instead, I listened. Bits and pieces came out through the neighborhood grapevine and the local news, and slowly but surely, it emerged that the lady murdered her adopted son. After she hit him so hard his skull cracked, she panicked and dragged him outside, and then staged it to look like he'd tripped. The autopsy proved that it wasn't an accident. The kid had bruises and scars all over him, and it's been going on for a while. Then the story got even darker when people started digging into the family's past. Turns out, they'd moved to our street because they'd been run out of their last neighborhood. Neighbors from their old place about an hour's drive away had reported them to Child Protective Services multiple times. There were stories of the kids showing up with bruises, of yelling heard through the walls, and the couple dodging questions about where the kids even came from. This was the 1980s, before the internet, before you could just Google someone's history. Back then, if you moved far away enough, you could bury your past, and that's what they'd done. Or at least they'd tried to do that. And the cops kept investigating them, and the biggest bombshell dropped during the murder charge. Those kids, the boy who died and the girl still living, weren't even legally adopted. The couple hadn't gone through an agency or court. They'd purchased them. That's the word that the news used, and it stuck with me. Purchased, like they were a car or a piece of furniture. No one knew exactly where the kids came from. Some said it was some shady deal with a desperate mother, and others said it was worse, like human trafficking. The police couldn't pin down the details because the couple wouldn't talk, but it was clear that those kids were never theirs, not in any real sense. The husband didn't get charged with the murder, but he went down for something else. Neglect or accessory, I can't remember exactly. But that lady, she got life. The trial was quick, and by the time it wrapped up, the family had been gone from the house for months. It sat empty for a while, the grass growing long with the windows all dark, and just about as close to a haunted house as it's possible to get if you ask me. Eventually, someone else moved in and life went back to normal, but I never forgot, and I don't think anyone else did either. Looking back, it's scary to think how close it all was. That house was right there, 50 feet from mine, and I'd ridden my bike past it 100 times. I'd seen those kids in the yard, how they seemed quiet but normal, and never thought twice about it. My parents didn't either, and no one did. The neighborhood was quiet, boring even, until one day, it just suddenly wasn't. And the whole thing lasted maybe 4 or 5 months from the day they moved in to the day the cops dragged them off. And it doesn't seem that long ago now that I look back on it, but it definitely left its mark on me. I was just a kid, barely a teenager, and I watched a murder investigation unfold across the street. And years later, I'd think about how easy it was for them to hide back then. There were no online records, no instant background checks. You could just pack up, move to a new town, and start over like nothing happened. And they almost got away with it too. If the lady hadn't killed that boy, if my dad hadn't heard her screaming, who knows how long they could have kept going. And just thinking about it makes me feel sick. Those kids never stood a chance. The boy didn't make it, and the girl, wherever she ended up, has to carry those memories with her, all because 2 people thought that they could buy children and treat them like trash. It's a terrible story, no way around it, and I really don't tell it often. Most people don't even want to hear something this terrible. But it's real. It happened. And it was my first lesson that the world wasn't as safe or simple as it looked from the bedroom window of a middle school-aged kid. Among the shadowy hollers of 19th century rural Tennessee, a series of terrifying occurrences would come to etch themselves into American folklore as some of the most sinister ever recorded. It was a force of malevolence so palpable, so relentless, that it claimed a life, drove a family to the brink of madness, and left a legacy of fear that lingers in the air of Robertson County to this day. But the force in question was no mere ghost story whispered around campfires. She was a woman who actually existed, and over time her deeds and devilry would earn her the nickname, the Bell Witch. This is not a tale of vague apparitions or spurious sightings. This is the true account of a presence so vile it defied explanation, and a nightmare that clawed its way into reality and refused to let go. The Bell family, consisting of John Sr., his wife Lucy, and their 9 children, had settled into their sprawling farmstead in 1804 and have since carved out a life of relative comfort amid the untamed beauty of the Tennessee frontier. For more than a decade, their days were marked by the rhythm of toil and harvest, the creak of wagon wheels and the laughter of their many children. But in the summer of 1817, everything changed. It began with a knock on the cabin walls, sharp and insistent, like knuckles rapping on the other side of the grave. The family dismissed it, claiming the sound was the result of wind on a loose branch or perhaps a restless animal. But then came the scratches, clawing at the windows as if something begged to be allowed inside. Night after night, the sounds grew louder, more deliberate, until the Bells could no longer deny them. John Bell Sr., a hardy, no-nonsense farmer with a dour demeanor, was the first to glimpse their vile visitor in the flesh. While walking through his cornfield one sweltering afternoon, he suddenly froze as a grotesque creature seemingly materialized before his eyes. He saw a dog-like beast with the head of a rabbit, its eyes glinting with a fiendish and unnatural hunger. In an instant, he shouldered and fired his musket, but as the shot echoed across the field, the canine creature vanished into thin air, leaving only the stench of sulfur and a creeping dread in its wake. That night, the knocking returned, fiercer and angrier than before, as if the beast had followed John Sr. home. The children began to see things too. Betsy, John's youngest daughter, wept as she described a girl in a green dress swinging from an oak tree, her neck twisted at an impossible angle. While Drury, one of his sons, swore a bird of monstrous size had flown down and perched itself atop the family barn, before staring at him with eyes that burned like fire and brimstone. And over time, the disturbances escalated with a ferocity that turned the Bells' family cabin into a crucible of terror. Furniture shook violently, while bed covers were ripped from sleeping bodies by invisible hands. Chains rattled across the floorboards, dragged by no discernible force, and the sightings of strange animals continued unabated. Then came the voices. They were mere whispers at first, hissing through the walls, followed by a raspy, guttural tone that seemed to claw its way up from the deepest circles of hell. "I am Kate," they declared. Suddenly, things started to make sense to old John Bell. Kate Batts had been the name of a deceased local woman rumored to have once cursed him over a land dispute. Yet whether it truly was her spirit or something far older masquerading in her name, no one could say. However, what was clear was that the spirit spoke with clarity that chilled the Bell family's blood, mocking them, revealing their deepest secrets, and taunting them with hints of horror yet to come. Little Betsy Bell, who was just 12 years old at the time, became Kate's favored target, as the witch poured her wrath upon her with a cruelty that defies comprehension. Invisible fists pummeled her fragile frame, leaving bruises and welts that bloomed like dark flowers across her skin. Her hair was yanked into knots so tight that it drew blood, with her screams swallowed by the night as the witch's ethereal voice cackled in delight. "You'll never know peace," it snarled, pinning her to the bed with a weight no human could lift. The family watched, helpless, as Betsy's bright spirit withered under the relentless assault. Her eyes grew hollow, and her voice was reduced to a mere whimper as the witch continued to deny her any rest. Neighbors flocked to the farm, drawn by tales of the disturbances, only to flee in terror as the witch turned its malice on them. It twisted up their insides, causing unimaginable pain, while hurling objects and shrieking curses that echoed through the trees. The witch might have targeted his children for particularly cruel torment, but it was the family's patriarch, John Sr., who bore the brunt of the witch's ultimate vendetta. She vowed to destroy him, and she pursued her goal with a sadistic and satanic zeal. His health unraveled as the haunting intensified. His tongue was swelled inexplicably, choking off his words. His face twitched with spasms that contorted into a mask of agony, while his limbs seized as if controlled by some cruel and malevolent mistress. The witch taunted him endlessly, her voice a venomous hiss in his ears. "I'll take your life, John Bell, and I'll dance on your grave." Eventually, on December 20th of 1820, after 3 years of relentless torment, John Sr.'s body finally failed him. He was found lifeless in his bed, having passed in his sleep with a vial of strange, foul-smelling liquid beside him. The family later confirmed it was poison, supposedly fed to him by the witch. The state of Tennessee recorded John's death as the only one officially attributed to a supernatural entity, a grim testament to the power of old Kate Batts, as well as the entity with which she'd compacted. Even Andrew Jackson, the fearless general and future president, proved unable to withstand the Bell Witch's fury. In 1819, he and his men camped on the Bell family's farm, eager to confront whatever entity inhabited the place. But as the wagon approached, its wheels locked inexplicably and the air filled with a deafening, hair-raising shriek. "I'd rather face the British Army than spend another night here," Jackson reportedly declared, fleeing before dawn with his troops in tow. If a man of his conviction was left quaking before the witch, what hope did a family of simple farmers have against it? The witch's reign of terror didn't end with John's death. It lingered, tormenting Betsy and the surviving Bells until 1821, when it abruptly announced its departure, but not without promising to return after 7 years. And true to its word, it reappears in 1828, shaking beds and whispering threats to Lucy and the remaining children before vanishing again. It vowed another return in 1935, 107 years later, and although no widespread haunting materialized, locals in Adams insist the entity never truly left. Strange lights flicker in the woods, disembodied screams pierce the silence of the night, and the Bell Witch Cave, a limestone hollow near the original farm, still undulates with an energy that drives visitors to the brink of sanity. Upon visiting the Bell Witch Cave, foolhardy visitors are greeted by what amounts to a gaping maw, its jagged walls glistening with slime and damp, while the air remains thick with a cloying and deeply unsettling stench. Those who brave its depths report footsteps echoing where no one walks, growls rumbling from the shadows, and a suffocating sense of being watched. In 1986, 2 reporters from the Tennessean planned to spend a night inside, armed with skepticism and flashlights. Yet staff writer David Gerard and staff photographer Bill Wilson lasted mere hours before bolting, driven out by guttural noises that swelled into a roar, a sound no cave should make. It was a short, powerful burst of sound that reverberated from the back of the cave and hit us like a slap, Gerard later wrote. It was not a metallic screech or the howl of wind. It was a vocal, loud, high-pitched scream, and we looked at each other, got through that gate, and quickly left the cave behind us. Of course, logically speaking, we frightened ourselves with our imaginations, Gerard continued. Or someone very much alive and human frightened us for fun and profit. Those are the reasonable explanations. But on the night in question, with my scalp tingling and my hair rising, our fear seemed reasonable, common sense. Gerard and Wilson seemed convinced that what they'd encountered was real. But was it actually the Bell Witch? And if so, what exactly is she? And many theories abound. Some call it Kate Batt's vengeful spirit, others a poltergeist fueled by Betsy Bell's adolescent turmoil. Yet some believe a demon masquerading as some kind of spirit is to blame. Science offers tepid explanations. Heavy metal poisoning might well account for John's symptoms, while mass hysteria seems to amplify and explain the rest. Yet such scientific theories fall flat against the hundreds of witnesses, from neighbors to clergy to President Jackson himself, who saw, heard, and felt the Bell Witch's wrathful presence. And surely no such hoax could sustain such terror for decades, nor would one be capable of leaving such a lasting scar on such a close-knit community. Today, the Bell family farm is long gone, but the Witch's Cave remains a pilgrimage site for thrill seekers and paranormal investigators alike. Every creak of the trees, every unexplained shadow carries the echo of old Kate Batt's mysterious malice. Locals speak of her in hushed tones, wary of invoking her name lest she turn her gaze their way. The Bell Witch is no campfire tale to be shrugged off at dawn. It's a wound in the fabric of reality, a reminder that some evils don't fade, they simply wait for its next victim. And in the stillness of the Tennessee night, when the wind dies and the darkness presses close, you might hear it. A faint knock, scratch, or whisper, which promises that the tale of the Bell Witch is far from over. When I was a kid, my parents worked in movies, which meant they traveled a lot, and so sometimes I'd live with my grandma for months at a time. She was a quiet woman, always up early, and I liked those quiet mornings with her. But right after I started 4th grade, something strange started happening at our house. It started when Grandma began noticing that when she got home from work, the receiver of the corded push-button phone next to her bed was always off the base. This was one of those old 80s style phones with a coiled cord and a heavy handset, and she'd come home to find it either dangling, resting on the table, or some variation of not hanging up. She started blaming me for it, saying that I must have been using it after school, and even though I swore on my innocence, she'd say things like, "Well, who else could it have been, sweetie?" And this went on for a few weeks. She'd come home, check the phone, and mention it almost every time it was off the hook. And it drove me crazy. I had no reason to touch that phone. I didn't call anyone, and no one called me. She wasn't mad at first, she just said that it bugged her. But after it continued to happen, she started getting irritated and asking why I was telling such silly little lies. I started to wonder if I was forgetting something, maybe just absent-mindedly knocking it off without realizing it whenever I jumped up on her bed to see if her car was coming down the driveway. But at the same time, I knew I wasn't. It was heavy as hell, so I'd have heard it falling. One afternoon, I got home earlier than usual, and to understand why this baffled us so much, you kind of need to understand the layout of the house a little, so bear with me while I paint a picture for you. It was a small house, with the front door opening up directly onto the living room, and from there you could see the dining room, the kitchen doorway, and the stairs leading to the bedrooms. Up on the second floor, my grandma's room was on the left, mine on the right, and there was a small bathroom at the end. The windows up there were all narrow, the kind that you crank open with screens that hadn't been replaced in years. They were too small for anyone to climb through, and even if someone ultra skinny did somehow shove themselves through in order to get in, getting out again without falling and breaking their legs would have been basically impossible. So as soon as I walked through the front door that day, I heard two distinct footsteps coming from my grandma's bedroom. They weren't loud, but they were clear. Two thuds like someone shifting their weight on the hardwood floor. I dropped my school bag by the door and walked up the stairs, expecting to see my grandma under the assumption that she too had gotten to finish early that afternoon. And the hallway was short, maybe 10 feet, so it took me only maybe a few seconds to get to her room. But when I stepped inside, there was no one there. And I'll never forget that feeling of creeping anxiety that I felt when I realized that something was clearly off. I had 100% heard footsteps. There was no disputing that. But when I walked into Grandma's room, the bed was made, the curtains were still, and nothing looked out of place. Nothing except the phone. Just like usual, the receiver was off the base and lying on the floor, while the cord was pulled as far as it could go without plugging from the wall. It wasn't tangled or coiled up like it would be if it had just fallen. It looked deliberate, like it had been placed there carefully. And I stood there for a moment, staring at it, not being able to figure out how it got that way. Later, I tried to recreate it myself. I shook the bedside table, tipped the phone over, and even knocked the receiver off with my hand. Every time, it either stayed on the table or fell close to it, the cord curling up naturally, and the only way I could get it to land like I found it, stretched out flat on the floor, was to pick it up, pull the cord tight, and set it down on purpose. And even then, I had to hold it for a second to keep it from sliding back. There was no way that it happened by accident. After running my little test, I picked up the receiver and hung it back on the base. But then, the second I did, the phone rang. And I remember getting a major jump scare from how loud it was, which kind of makes me chuckle to think about today, but that's just about the only thing that does. Everything else is just weird. Now anyway, I answered the phone and it was my grandma. I guess I sounded nervous, so she asked what was wrong, and I just lied and said that I was fine. And then she explained how she'd called a few minutes earlier, right before I got home, I figured, and someone had picked up the phone. And whoever it was didn't say anything, just held the line for a little while until Grandma hung up. She'd been trying to call back ever since, but the line was busy. She thought the person who picked up her first call was me, and knowing it wasn't had that feeling of anxiety creeping back. I told her what happened, how I'd just gotten home and heard footsteps, and how it wasn't me that answered her first call. Grandma kind of paused and then said that she was coming home as quickly as she could. She told me to leave the room, told me that she was going to call the police, and then hung up. When Grandma said that she was calling 911, I felt this weird mix of relief and dread. Relief because I wasn't going to be alone in the house much longer, but dread because, well, what if I was never alone in the home? I backed out of her room, keeping my eyes on the phone like it might jump off the hook again if I turned away. The hallway felt narrower than usual, and every creak of the floor under my sneakers made me flinch. I made it downstairs and stood in the living room right by the front door so I could bolt if I needed to. The house was dead quiet now. No footsteps, no hum of the fridge, just an eerie silence like everything was holding its breath. I kept glancing up the stairs, half expecting to see a shadow move across the wall, but it was just the same dim light spilling out of Grandma's doorway. Maybe 10 minutes later, I heard sirens, and they started faint and then got louder until red and blue flashing lights were entering through the living room curtains. Grandma's car pulled into the driveway maybe only a minute after the police cruiser did, and I opened the front door before anyone could knock. 2 officers stepped out, then Grandma too, her coat still half on with a look of worry on her face, and she thanked the 2 cops, ran over to me, and then pulled me into a hug and asked if I was okay. I nodded, but my throat felt way too dry to say much. One of the cops came over and asked me to explain what had happened, so I told him about the footsteps, the phone stretched out on the floor, and Grandma's call. He listened and then told us to stay put while he and his partner checked the house. Grandma and I sat on the couch, her arm around me as the officers went upstairs. I could hear their boots on the hardwood, very deliberate and heavy, exactly like those 2 soft thuds that I'd heard earlier. The tall one called down after a minute saying it was clear, but they wanted us to come up and see if anything looked off. We climbed the stairs together, Grandma holding my hand tighter than usual, and her room looked the same as I'd left it. The phone was back on its holder, the bed still made, and the curtains were hanging fine. And the officers asked if anything was missing, but Grandma shook her head. I remember how one of the cops crouched by the phone, just sort of squinting at the cord. He asked me if I was certain that it was stretched out flat, and I nodded, and he picked up the receiver, letting it dangle. It swung a little, and then settled with the cord coiled up near the table, just like in my tests. He said, "Huh, weird," and then put it back on the stand. They checked my bedroom room next, and then the bathroom, and even cranked open one of those narrow windows to see if the screen was loose. Everything was fine. No footprints, no scratches, no sign that anyone had been there. One of the cops just shrugged and said that it might have been a prank call or someone messing with the line, but that didn't explain the footsteps or the phone being off the hook every day. They told us to lock up tight and call if anything else happened, and then they left. Grandma made us some tea for our nerves, and then we just sat at the dining room table trying to reassure ourselves. I remember how she said, maybe it's the house settling, but her voice didn't sound convinced, and I didn't buy it either. Houses don't settle in 2 quick thuds, and they don't pick up phones either. That night, I slept in her room on a pile of blankets that she spread out on the floor next to her bed. Neither of us wanted to be alone. The phone stayed quiet, but I kept waking up, staring at it in the dark, waiting for it to ring or, be even worse, move. But it didn't. And the next morning, Grandma decided that we'd figure out what was going on ourselves. She'd called in sick to work, and we spent the day just rigging up a little test. She had this old tape recorder from when my dad was a kid, one of those big old clunky things with a microphone, and we set it up in her room aimed directly at the phone. And the plan was pretty simple. Leave it running while we went out for a while and then see if it recorded anything. I wasn't sure to do anything useful. I mean, what we really needed was a video camera, but it felt better than just sitting around and waiting for the next weird thing to happen. We drove to the diner a few blocks away, ate pancakes neither of us finished, and came back after about an hour. The house looked the same. The front door was locked and the windows were shut, but my stomach tied itself into knots as we climbed the stairs and entered her room. Grandma then hit stop on the recorder, rewound the tape, and pressed play. At first we didn't hear anything. There was just static and the faint hum of the house. Grandma started fast-forwarding the tape and stopped it every so often. Then about 20 minutes in, after yet more silence, we each heard distinctive thuds, clear as anything, like someone was stepping across the floor. Grandma's grip tightened on my shoulder as we listened, then a few seconds later, we heard a soft click, which was almost certainly the sound of the phone lifting off the base. But after that, there was nothing. No breathing, no voices, just dead air until the tape hissed to a stop. And I remember each of us looking at the recorder and then at each other, and then Grandma said, "That's it. We're getting out of here." She didn't call the police again. She said they'd just tell us the same thing as last time. And instead, she packed up a bag for both of us and we drove to my aunt's place about an hour away. And I didn't argue. I didn't want to spend another minute in that house. A few days later, Grandma got a call from her neighbor, Mr. Haxel, who had been keeping an eye on the house. He said that he'd gone to water the plants and found the phone off the hook again, cord stretched out flat on the floor, and nothing else was touched. No broken locks, no open windows, just the phone. And Grandma thanked him, hung up, and then politely informed him his services were no longer required. I don't know what he said in response, but before she hung up, Grandma made it clear to old Mr. Haxel that he wasn't going to go into her house anymore. She didn't explain why, and I guess Mr. Haxel must have found that very confusing, maybe even kind of rude. And I asked Grandma why she didn't tell him about the phone or the thuds, and she said that she didn't want to scare him. We stayed with my aunt for the rest of that school year. Grandma sold the house a few months later, and she let some realtor handle all of it and never stepped foot in that place ever again. The new owners didn't mention anything strange, at least not that we heard. Maybe it stopped, maybe it didn't. Years later, I asked Grandma if she ever figured out what it was. She just shook her head and said that she didn't want to think about it. I don't either, but as much as I wish it could, that doesn't stop me. I don't know who was in that house with us, but I know it wasn't me knocking that receiver off. I know it wasn't Grandma either, and since I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that, I can only assume it was one of her neighbors. I sometimes wonder how they got in, but those thoughts are always quickly overridden by a much more frightening idea. That one of our neighbors had unwillingly made us part of some sick fantasy that thankfully they never had the chance to realize. When I was 8 years old, our neighbor robbed my dad at gunpoint. It happened on a Tuesday evening in late October. My dad had just gotten home from work and was unloading groceries from the car. I was inside watching TV when I heard a loud bang. At first I thought it was the screen door slamming shut, but then I heard my dad yelling. I ran to the window and saw a man pointing a gun at my dad's chest, and I could tell right away that it was our neighbor, who lived about 3 houses down the street. He took my dad's wallet and the car keys and then ran off into the woods behind our house. My dad stumbled inside, pale and shaking, and then called the police. The cops caught my neighbor later that night. They found him hiding in a shed about a mile away, still carrying the gun and my dad's stolen stuff. He'd been drinking and needed money for more booze, and that's what the police told us anyway. He went to prison for armed robbery, and for a while, things felt safer. I didn't have to see his rusted pickup truck parked down the street. I didn't hear his dog barking and nothing all night. But I didn't find any peace because the memory of that night stuck with me. I kept picturing that gun, the way it looked under the porch light, and my dad's hands shook after he raised them into the air. And 5 years later, when I was 13, that neighbor got out. And I found out because I saw that same rusted pickup truck parked in his driveway one afternoon when I got off the school bus. I remember how my stomach twisted up into knots before I ran inside and told my dad, and he was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his paper, and then when I told him, he looked tired but not surprised. He said that neighbor had served his time and had every right to come back to his own home. And I didn't care about his rights. All I could think about was that gun and how close he'd been to pulling the trigger and taking my only surviving parent away from me. My mother passed away from a rare form of cancer when I was still a baby. The first night after that neighbor got back, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in that house made me jump, and I kept checking the locks on the windows. My dad noticed that I was on edge and tried to calm me down, and he told me that neighbor wasn't stupid enough to try anything again, not with the police keeping an eye on him. He also added that people can change, and we had to give him a chance. I nodded, but I didn't believe it. All I could picture was him with wild eyes and the way he waved that gun like he'd already made up his mind to kill my dad. and the nightmares started soon after. I'd dream about him breaking into our home, the gun in his hand, only this time my dad wasn't there to stop him. I'd wake up sweating, my heart pounding, and lie there staring at the ceiling until I saw daylight at my window. And it went on like that for weeks and then months, and I'm pretty sure it took a heavy toll on my health. I stopped riding my bike past his house and took the long way around the block to avoid even looking at it. I hated feeling so scared at the time, and there didn't seem to be anything I could do to shake it. And the neighbors stayed in that house for 2 more years. I suggested that we move, but Dad said that we couldn't afford it. And I don't know what he did all day, probably nothing since his truck barely moved. But then one spring, when I was 15, I noticed a for sale sign in his yard. A few weeks later, the truck was gone and the house sat empty, and it felt like a small miracle, like God had answered one of my many, many prayers. My dad said that he heard that guy move to another state, maybe to live with family, and I didn't care where he went as long as he was gone. The nightmares didn't stop right away, but they got less frequent, and eventually, I found that I could walk by that house without my chest tightening and my legs screaming at me to run. It's still there, down the road, and it doesn't feel like his anymore. But the thing that really bothers me is that even though he's out of our lives, there's still a little portion of the memory that he'll forever occupy, and I find myself wanting more than anything to just forget. When I was in 5th grade, this new family moved into the trailer near our house. My grandpa owned it and rented it out to them, and seeing as they had 2 kids that were roughly mine and my brother's age, we were both really excited to meet them. There was Jessica, who was my age, and her little brother Jack, who was 9, same as my brother, and they seemed okay at first. Jessica was friendly and we got along fine. Jack was a different story altogether though, but I'll get to that later. Their dad was a very strange guy. He'd buy old furniture, chairs, tables, whatever he could get his hands on, and then he'd stack it up with trash in his backyard and just set it all on fire. And it happened so often that I stopped noticing the smell of smoke, and when they finally moved out, they left behind a pile of charred junk, blackened wood, and just twisted metal frames. And their trailer was a mess too, with oil stains smeared across the floors and walls. One time I went inside to find Jessica. Her dad was there, shirtless, sitting in a stained chair with a beer in his hand, and he just looks up at me and his eyes are hard and cold, and I froze. I didn't say anything, I just turned around, walked out, and never went back. And before things went bad, the 4 of us, me, Jessica, Jack, and my brother, used to ride our bikes together. Jessica was nice and easy to talk to, and we'd race down the dirt path behind the trailer, kicking up dust and laughing when one of us almost wiped out. Jack tagged along, but like I said, he was a totally different story to his sister. He'd show up to our house half-dressed, no shirt, sometimes no shoes, and snot was always smeared across his face, and he'd wipe it with his arm like it didn't bother him. My mom caught him peeing in her flower bed more than once, and she'd yell at him, but he'd just sort of grin and run off. And one time he grabbed the tassels on my bike and yanked them as I was riding, which almost caused me to fall off. I was mad, but we just kept letting him hang around. He was Jessica's brother, and she was our friend, but then there was the time with the bow and arrow. I didn't even know Jack had it until he showed up at our house carrying it. It wasn't a toy, and it certainly didn't look like one either. His dad hunted deer with it for real, and I guess he'd been showing Jack how to use it, which is how he'd found out where it was kept. We were in the yard messing around when Jack pulled the string back and aimed it right at my brother's head. The arrow was knocked, the tip sharp enough to kill. My little brother didn't move. He just stood there, with his eyes wide. I screamed at Jack to stop, and he laughed like it was some game. He didn't shoot, but he didn't lower it right away either. My mom came running out and saw what was happening and just lost it. She grabbed my brother and me and dragged us inside and then told us that we weren't allowed to play with them anymore. Jessica and Jack kept coming over after that, knocking on the door, calling out our names, and we'd just sit inside and stay quiet waiting for them to leave. Jessica would ask why we weren't coming out, and her voice just sounded very small and confused, and Jack would bang harder, just yelling out nonsense. It made us both cry, and it went on for weeks until they finally stopped. Years later, Jack and Jessica popped into my head randomly. The trailer was gone by then. Grandpa had hauled it off after the mess they left. But I couldn't shake the memory of that pile of burnt furniture, their dad's blank stare, and the look in Jack's eyes when he aimed that drawn-back bow at my little brother. I wondered what it was like for Jessica and Jack living in that place. Their parents just didn't seem to care much. Jack was wild for sure, but maybe he didn't have a chance to be anything else. No one was wiping his nose or telling him not to pee in flowers. And Jessica was different, but she was stuck there too. And while reminiscing, I remember how one night I woke up to a sound outside my window. It was late. The house was dark, and still as I pulled back the curtain on my bedroom window, I saw someone moving near the trees, someone too small to be an adult. I squinted and I thought I saw Jack's messy hair and his skinny frame. He was just standing there staring at the house, and then I blinked and he was gone. Maybe it was a dream, or maybe I'd imagined it, but I locked my windows that night, and it took me a long time before I finally got back to sleep. And looking back on everything, I feel bad for them. Jessica was a good friend, and Jack, while seeming like a total psycho, was clearly just a messed up kid without good parents. Their dad scared me, and I don't even really remember seeing the mom around. I don't know where they went after they left, but back then, all I knew was the fear of that arrow, and the sound of their knocks fading away, and the uneasy quiet that settled over our house when they were finally gone. My name is Sarah. I'm 24 and I live with my roommate Emma in an apartment in the suburbs of Atlanta. We're both very safety conscious, which is why we've decked out our place with a Ring peephole camera and a digital lock on our door. We thought that we were being smart, proactive really. But none of that prepared us for our neighbor, David. About 3 months ago, the sweet little family across the hall moved out and David moved in. The first time we saw him, we couldn't believe our eyes. He was hauling in boxes upon boxes of anime figurines, Star Wars posters, lightsabers, the works. Emma and I are both very nerdy people ourselves, so a few days after the moving trucks left, we decided to be good neighbors. We put together a welcome to the neighborhood gift basket, some homemade Red Dead Redemption 2 cookies, seasonal candles, and stuff like that. We knocked on his door, smiled, and handed it over. But he just mumbled an awkward thank you and barely made any eye contact, and that was that. We were kind of disappointed, but not everyone is an extrovert, right? And we figured it'd be kind of nice to have a quiet neighbor for once, even if it was a little antisocial. But it didn't take long for things to get weird. At first, it was innocent enough. Annoying, but innocent. David started popping out of his apartment every time he'd heard one of us in the hallway, like he'd been waiting by the door. He'd ask us how we were, or if we had any spare sugar or toilet paper or a screwdriver he could borrow. You name it, he'd think it up and ask for it. Sometimes he'd knock on our door and ask if we watched his apartment for an hour while he ran errands, as in he wanted us to hang out in his apartment until we came back. And we just politely say no, but it didn't seem to register. He'd just nod and shuffle back to his place, only to ask again a few days later. Emma started joking that he was our third roommate, but I could tell that she was pretty creeped out too. Then about a month after he moved in, everything just went off the rails. It was a Saturday night, and we'd been out late partying near the Braves Stadium, and we stumbled home at around 3 a.m., a little drunk but otherwise in control of ourselves, only to freeze when we hit the landing between our apartment and David's. And there he was, sitting cross-legged on the landing like some kind of yogi. As soon as he saw us, his face lit up, and then he stood up before awkwardly asking where we'd been. When we told him, he said that he'd been worried sick and how in the future we needed to tell him if we were going out for the night. We were too stunned to process it at first, and then Emma almost burst out laughing, but despite managing to stifle it, David realized that she was laughing at him. His cheeks went red and we brushed past him into our apartment. But the next morning, when we checked the Ring footage, neither of us were laughing anymore. After we'd gone inside, David hadn't left. He'd sat back down in the hallway facing our door and stayed there for hours. The timestamp showed him sitting there, either staring at our apartment door or rocking back and forth staring at the floor until nearly 6 in the morning. It was like that scene from Paranormal Activity where he's speeding up the footage but the person is barely moving. It was creepy as hell. We called the cops, but they were useless. They only said that we could contact them if he made a direct threat or tried to get into our apartment. But since it's a shared space, they couldn't do anything about him lurking on the landing outside of our door. We're pretty sure the complex said something to him, though. We logged a complaint with them too because for the first 5 days, there was radio silence. No knocks, no creepy hallway chats. All his creepy behavior stopped for a while. We started to relax, thinking maybe he'd gotten the hint. But we were so wrong about that. A few weeks after his little ceasefire, right when we figured it was all over, he'd lost it completely. He was out there all the time, sitting outside our door, pacing the hallway, watching us and mumbling creepy stuff under his breath. Emma started leaving for work an hour early just to avoid him, sneaking out like she's escaping a prison. I worked from home, so I was basically trapped. Every time I cracked the door to grab a package or take out the trash, there he was, waiting. He'd yell something like, "Hey, you look nice today," or "Why don't you come hang out with me?" Just innocent sounding stuff if you were just listening in, but there was an implication. And then whenever no one was within earshot, he'd say stuff like this one time when he told me in so many words, "If you don't come over to my apartment, I'll kill you both while you sleep. Nice and quiet, no one will hear a thing." I was so goddamned angry, but I was so stunned by the sudden upgrade to his threats that I didn't know what to say in reply. I just speed walked back into our apartment, shut the door and locked it, and then cried until Emma got home from work. It was a total nightmare for the longest time. He started leaving notes, handwritten love letters taped on our door or slipped under the bottom, even stuck to our cars in the parking lot sometimes. They were totally unhinged too. One said, "I want you both to be my wives," and the idea of Emma being my sister wife would have been funny if it wasn't such a tangible and terrifying threat. And another one got graphic, stuff I can't even repeat here, these fantasies that made me want to gag. We noticed that he put up his own Ring doorbell after a while, angled so it was clearly watching our door. Every time we'd leave and come back, there was a new note waiting, and we realized that he'd only installed the camera so he could figure out when we were gone. "Missed you today," one note said, but the worst was, "You're so beautiful when you sleep." Our bedroom windows faced the back of the building, and we were on the 3rd floor. We figured no way he could see in, but then one night, I woke up at 2 a.m. to a faint scratching sound. I crept to the window, scared out of my mind, and peeked through the blinds, and I swear I saw a shadow move, like some dark figure on the edges of the streetlight below. And I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but I was so scared that I barely slept that night. We called the police again about David's threats, but since the only thing we had in writing were his quote-unquote nice notes, they said their hands were tied. The best they could do was advise us to get a restraining order, like that's some magic fix that you can get overnight. Even if we did, how long would that take? And what was he going to do in the meantime? In the end, we broke our lease to just get the hell out of there and secure our own safety. It cost us a ton of money, and that hurt in its own way. But after literally one night apiece in this Airbnb we rented as like an interim apartment, it started to feel like a loss worth swallowing. We got a new place together in some place the neighbors weren't psychos, and lived happily ever after until Emma moved out to go live with her boyfriend, now husband. We're still good friends, but we've never forgotten living next to David, and I don't think we ever will. I lived in a basement apartment. It was small, a damp space with one window near my bed directly under the house upstairs. When I first moved in, a very nice lady who will remain nameless lived above me with her 2 kids and her boyfriend, Ryan. Now back then, things were fine. Ryan was always an angry drunk, but she acted as a buffer and kept him in check. But 2 years into me living there, she left him and took the kids, and after that, it was just me and Ryan. And it felt like I had been thrown to the wolves. Ryan had always been hostile. Early on, after my friends left, I made a mistake. I tossed an Amazon box in his recycling bin without breaking it down, but instead of a simple, "Hey, don't do that," he texted me, "You stupid effing C-word, you put this in my trash and didn't even break it down." And that wasn't the first time that he talked to me like that, it was just the loudest. A year and a half before, I told him to never speak to me again and blocked his number, and it didn't stop him. Parking there was an absolute nightmare. I'd been at that place for 3 years and only got worse. I worked nights, so I was stuck with whatever spots were left when I got home. And one night after midnight, I pulled into the driveway behind Ryan's car. I figured that he wouldn't need to leave that late, and I'd move mine by 7 a.m. so he wasn't blocked. But I was wrong. At 12:30 a.m., just as I got into bed, he starts screaming my name and pounding on the door. "C-word this, get out here, you C-word." And I dragged myself outside and moved the car, and he followed me, ranting and calling me all sorts of terrible things. He raised his hand like he was going to hit me. I stared him down and said, "Oh, we're gonna hit me now, Ryan. Gonna hit a woman, huh?" And he just sort of sneered. "You're not a woman. You're..." And he goes on to say more expletives, and I just went back inside, my heart racing. And that was when I started planning to move. October was the goal, but the area was expensive and I couldn't make it happen fast enough. And then one day, it changed everything. Ryan had a 19-year-old daughter who split time between his place and her mom's. She didn't stay there often, but her bedroom was right above mine. Her window was always open. Mine usually wasn't. Basement air was stale, but I dealt with it. That day I cracked my window for some air and I had my TV on, volume at maybe 24, and I lived there long enough to know that 30 was the limit before it bothered anyone upstairs. My friend used to text me if it got too loud, but with the windows open, yeah, Ryan's daughter probably heard it too. She'd stomped on the floor before when she thought I was loud, and I'd ignore it mostly. This time, I'd had enough of the disrespect. I stepped outside and called up to her window. "Hey, if you thought I was too loud, close your window." She exploded, saying, "Listen, it's quiet hours, you effing loser who lives in our basement." And we never even spoken before. I tried to stay calm. She was just a kid, but I yelled back that she was disrespectful. But she kept screaming at me just like her dad. And I snapped. "Oh, you just like your dad, huh?" And went inside. And the next morning at 7:30 a.m., I woke up to Ryan hammering on my door. It sounded like he was trying to break it down, screaming terrible things. You called my daughter a..." he roared. All this insane stuff. And I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and started recording, and his fists slammed the wood, the frame rattling. "Open the door," he screamed. I stayed silent, frozen, and he kept going, screaming these threats. I called the police, but they didn't do anything. They said it was a civil matter since he didn't actually hit me. He didn't stop, though. Later, as I unloaded groceries from my car, he leaned out of his window and yelled, "Yeah, keep moving, you fat effing C-word." I'm sorry to keep using that, but that seems to be a theme with the way he would talk to me. It was genuinely insane. And I decided that I'd move at the end of August, not October. I couldn't stay there. And that night after the grocery incident, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel right. My window was still cracked open, and I hadn't closed it after the fight with his daughter. At around 2 a.m., I heard something. A faint scrape, like metal on glass. I sat up, straining to listen, and it came again, sharper from the window. I crept over, peering out into the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the empty backyard and the silhouette of Ryan's house looming above. And then I saw it. A glint, quick and small, like a blade catching the moonlight, and my blood turned to ice. I slammed the window shut, locked it, and backed away. Was he out there? I couldn't tell, but I didn't sleep that night. At 4 a.m., I heard footsteps upstairs, very heavy and very deliberate, pacing right above my bed. Ryan's daughter wasn't there that night. I'd seen her leave earlier, and it was just him. Morning came slow. I checked the window. Scratches marked the glass, very thin and very jagged, like someone had dragged something sharp across it. I packed faster after that, throwing clothes into bags, counting the days until August ended, but the nights got worse. One night, I could hear breathing, low, steady, and right outside the window. I didn't look, though. I couldn't. I turned the TV on, volume at 10, and just to drown it out. It stopped after an hour, but I still didn't sleep. And the next day, I found a note slipped under my door. No words, just a crude drawing of a stick figure with a knife in its chest. And my hands shook as I crumpled it up. I called the police again, and they came, looked at it, and said they'd talk to him, but I could tell they really didn't care. And in the end, I made it out. By the last day of August, I loaded my final box into my car and drove away from that basement apartment, leaving Ryan and his rage behind. I found a new place, a small, quiet unit on the second floor of a building with no shared walls and no looming houses above me. The first night, I slept with the window open, letting the cool air drift in, and heard nothing but the hum of distant traffic. And for the first time in years, I felt that tension unwind from my shoulders. I unpacked slowly and settled in and reclaimed the peace that had been stolen from me. Ryan was gone from my life, and I was finally free. My name's Koba. I'm a longtime listener, and I figured that I should finally just sit down and write out my story. I live with my family on the Yakama Indian Reservation here in Washington. I've lived here all my life, and the reality is a lot different than what you might read about or see on TV. There's a lot of natural beauty here, and that's definitely true. Even having grown up with the cascades in the background anytime you're outside, you'd think I might be used to it by now. But every time your eyes wander while you're driving and you're out hunting or fishing, there's almost one of those wow moments, or the mountains catch the light in just the right way, or you come across a scene straight from a Hobbit movie. I love those, by the way. But beneath all that natural splendor, there's a lot of hardship and a lot of violence here on the res, especially when it comes to drugs and alcohol addiction. Drugs, particularly meth, have been a dark cloud hanging over this reservation for literally decades at this point. It's everywhere, seeping into every corner of people's lives. I've known good people with families, jobs, everything a person could want, have their entire lives swallowed up by it. It's not just a drug here. It's more like a disease that's put down roots throughout the community, leaving almost no one untouched. You see it in the empty, tired eyes of the young kids whose parents have been affected by it. And you see it in the empty, boarded-up houses that were once home to generations of the same family. And you see it in the same crime rates that just keep on climbing, without fail, year in and year out. As one old friend of mine put it, it takes normal, regular life and it turns into some kind of survival situation. And in survival situations, you got your predators, and where there's predators, there's prey. All the robberies, break-ins, and burglaries are bad enough, but the violence is by far the worst. It's not just the physical fights that you hear about, but the whole atmosphere of fear and distrust that it breeds. I've seen how meth can change people, how they lose themselves to paranoia, aggression, and eventually, insanity. Which leads me to a story that still sends shivers down my spine. Back when I was a kid, there was this school teacher who I'll just call Mrs. L. She was one of the good ones, the kind that fills you with the hope of the future. And she taught at the local school and had a way with the kids that made learning seem like fun and not a total drag. Her classroom was a sanctuary, a place where you could forget about all the bad things going on in the outside world. And Mrs. L lived in a small but cozy-looking home near the edge of town, where the houses start to thin out and the wild begins to take over. She was known for her kindness, often baking cookies for the kids or helping out at the community events, and was loved by everyone, not just her students, but the whole community. But then one night, something truly tragic and terrible happened, but also something so twisted that it's still hard for me to wrap my head around, even all these years later. There was this guy, Nash, who everyone knew was deep into meth. He'd been in and out of trouble for years, but then one day he started acting even stranger than usual. And the word was that he thought people were out to get him, that he was being spied on or some nonsense like that. But others could see what was happening to him clear as anything else. It was the meth, rotting his mind away, and not long after he seemed to lose it completely. One night, probably after a few days of binging on crystal, Nash walked out of his house and went walking around the res all keyed up and psychotic. Everyone knew to lock their doors and to avoid all contact with him when he was acting like that, and usually speaking, he'd head straight back home once he started to come down and then stay indoors all night getting high. But what happened that night was beyond anyone's worst nightmare. In his meth-induced psychosis, Nash decided to break into the next house he came across, and the next house he came across belonged to our beloved Mrs. L. The details are pretty gruesome, something most of us can't even stomach talking about. He didn't just kill her. He ate parts of her body, driven by whatever twisted reality his meth-addled mind had constructed for him. Someone later said that he told the cops it was because he thought eating someone that pure would clean out his soul or something. I don't know how true that is, but it sure rings true, and that alone is chilling enough. The next morning when Mrs. L didn't show up for school, people went over to check on her, and what they found was a scene from a horror movie. Nash was still there, in a state of confusion and terror, not even fully understanding what he'd done. I heard he attacked the folks who showed up, thinking that they were trying to sort of set him up for something. And they managed to hold him off until the cops showed up. Then Nash was taken away. But the damage was already done, and it couldn't be undone either. An innocent life had been snuffed out forever. And as you can probably imagine, news of Mrs. L's murder shook the entire reservation to its core. It wasn't just the murder itself which got to people either. It was the realization of just how deep the drug problem had sunk. For weeks afterwards, there were meetings, talks, and vigils. People were scared, angry, and desperate for change. They talked about rehab, about bringing in more resources, about how to protect our community from falling further into the abyss. But change is very slow here. The meth continues to flow, and it finds new victims every single day. In the aftermath, we've seen some changes. A new rehab center opened, funded by tribal grants and donations. And we've learned to look after each other more, to notice when someone's slipping and offer a hand before they fall too deep. There are more patrols, more community watch groups, and there's talk about bringing in educational programs to teach the youth about the dangers of drugs. We've held ceremonies, traditional healing sessions, where elders speak of our ancestors' resilience, reminding us that we're not the first to face such darkness. Every time I walk past Mrs. L's old house, now boarded up and silent, I'm reminded of what we lost and what we're fighting for. It's not just about stopping drug use, it's about reclaiming our community, our identity, and our future. The story of Mrs. L is a scar on our collective memory, but it's also a testament to our spirit and our commitment to not let the darkness define us. Mrs. L's memory lives on, not because of how horrifying her death was, but because of the light that she shone into people's lives. Because here on the Yakama Reservation, we're more than our struggles. We're a people with a rich history, a deep culture, and a fierce will to survive and thrive despite the shadows that try to consume us. Nash, on the other hand, left a very different legacy. His story isn't just a cautionary tale. It's a reminder of how drugs can strip away humanity, turn a person into a monster they never wanted to be. In living here, you learn to be cautious. You keep your eyes open not just for your own safety, but for your neighbors. We're a tight-knit community, but the drugs are like a slow poison. But there's resilience too. We gather, we talk, we remember. And in our small ways, we try to rebuild what's been broken. This happened a while ago, 2015-ish, but I'll probably never forget it. I was around 21 at the time. I'm female and still fairly new to the city. I had just gotten out of a bad relationship, wasn't in the best place mentally, and didn't know many people in town besides my ex and his friends. I was on a dating/hookup app looking for people to hang out with casually, maybe find a friends with benefits or something. I matched with a 25-year-old guy named Simon. We talked sporadically in the app for a few days, and he told me he was in a band and lived in a house with his bandmates. He sent me their music, just an audio track on YouTube with a heavily edited still image of 4 or 5 guys playing rock instruments, and one of them looked like him. The music was an odd mix of styles and not really my thing, but whatever. He seemed like a nice enough guy. After a few days, he stopped replying, and I figured that was that and moved on. Then, one day at work, I got a message from him apologizing for being busy and inviting me to a barbecue with his friends and bandmates in their yard. He had mentioned that their band manager provided the house to them to live in, and given the lack of views on their YouTube video and the fact that I had only seen one photo of him playing in the band, I figured he was probably exaggerating. I assumed it was more likely a bar manager friend gave them a discount on rent in exchange for being a house band or something, and I didn't think much of it beyond that. Normally, I wouldn't have agreed to go to a barbecue alone in a stranger's house, but I was really bored and figured that I might be able to overcome some social anxiety, maybe even make some female friends since he made it sound like a big party. I looked up the neighborhood that he gave me, and it was a suburban area with lots of families. I figured being in a yard on a nice summer day wouldn't be overly risky because there would be plenty of neighbors outside. Plus, it was just a few train stops away from my workplace and I was off in a few hours. I told him I wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea since I didn't know him well, but I'd stop by for a bit as long as I didn't have to go inside the house. He assured me that was totally fine, which made me feel better. I even avoided drinking anything for the rest of my shift so I wouldn't have to use the bathroom and risk going inside. Since he had implied the event was already underway, I was anxious about just showing up. Plus, I knew finding a specific address from the backyard side would be kind of tricky, so I asked Simon if he could meet me at the train station since he said it was a quick walk. He agreed, and I let him know when I was leaving work and what time my train would arrive at his station. Now, red flag number 1, when I got to the train station at around 5:30 p.m., I looked around but couldn't find him. I messaged him and he said he was running behind and told me to start walking toward the neighborhood. I was about halfway across the massive train station parking lot when I finally spotted him wandering toward me. I recognized his clothes, bell-bottoms, not common, especially for men at the time, and long hair. But up close, his face looked noticeably different from his photos. Maybe it was heavy-duty editing, or maybe he used pictures of his brother or something. I don't even know. But he looked older. Not 25. More like 35. And this was the first real red flag, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just self-conscious. Maybe he smoked a lot and never wore sunscreen. Maybe he just hadn't taken new pictures in a while. And besides, I was mostly there to make friends, so I told myself not to judge. Oh, and he was already very drunk. But a lot of my ex's friends were heavy drinkers, so that didn't seem strange. He was hosting a barbecue with friends after all. The second red flag came shortly after when we arrived at the front door. I reminded him that I wasn't comfortable going inside the house, but he assured me that we just had to walk through to get to the backyard. Okay, fine. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood where you could just walk around the house to get to the backyard. We would have had to backtrack to the main road to go down the alley directly to the backyard, and I figured he just forgot what I said about not wanting to go inside and didn't want to cause a bunch of trouble, so I just sort of went with it. We got into the house and he immediately closed the door and locked the deadbolt and knob behind me. I didn't think that was too weird, since nobody was hanging out inside and a lot of people were just in the habit of locking the door when they come in, but it did still give me the heebie-jeebies for some reason. Then Simon told me that he'd really like to give me a tour of the house. I politely declined and reminded him that I was just there for the barbecue, and he said that he and his bandmates had worked really hard to get the house and was really proud of it. At that point, I was getting really skeptical because usually when guys would tell me things that seemed a bit far-fetched, they'd let the truth slip by the time they got me in their house. But still, I convinced myself that I was being unreasonable. I was already in a stupid house anyways, and he insisted to be quick. Not the wisest choice again, I know. But I was pretty good at explaining away red flags, so at this point, Simon still mostly had a dopey stoner art guy kind of vibe as far as I was concerned. He didn't really seem like a threat, just an insecure oddball who sucks at communicating and fibs a bit. Not unlike my ex, who was definitely emotionally and verbally abusive, but it never escalated past that. I figured at worst, he'd get handsy and I'd get called a prude for not sleeping with him. I didn't have a lot of self-worth at that time, obviously, so once again, I just went with it. The tour started pretty uneventfully, other than the decor in the common area was obviously chosen by a middle-aged Martha Stewart enthusiast and not a bunch of guys in a band or their fake band manager. I didn't know if this should make me feel better or worse. On one hand, he was clearly lying, but on the other, it made me think it was probably just someone's mom's house and she was out of town and didn't want to tell me that he lived at a friend's parents' home and didn't actually have a paying job. Again, total red flag, but I could rationalize it at the time. The bedroom's doors were all closed, bathroom was unremarkable, and he then showed me the kitchen and I finally saw through the window that there was nobody in the backyard. There weren't even barbecue supplies around. No burgers thawing on the counter, no cocktail supplies lying around, nothing. I asked him where everyone was and why he lied about the barbecue, and he told me that his bandmates were still on tour, and they were just running behind due to van trouble, but they should be back any minute so we could start the party. I asked him why he wasn't on tour with them, if he's in the band. I don't even remember what his answer was to that because it didn't make any sense. And at this point, I'm out of mental gymnastics to convince myself that this guy isn't just completely full of crap, and I'm really freaked out. It took me long enough. I'm smarter now, don't worry. I started trying to figure out a way to get out of this situation, though. I hoped that once he was done with the tour, we could go outside, even just for a minute, and I'd just leave. I've been in some sketchy situations in the past, but luckily, nothing so bad that they tried very hard to physically stop me when I walked away in a semi-public place. I just wasn't comfortable doing it inside the house. I knew this guy was full of crap, but I had no idea how much worse it would get. I instinctively pretended to believe his nonsense. He offered me a beer and I said no thanks because I had to work in the morning. He said okay and cracked one open for himself. He then wanted to take the tour downstairs, and I could see from the top of the stairs that the basement was the dark and creepy kind with really small windows, so right there, thankfully I refused. I asked if we could go back outside, and he said after the tour. I tried to argue about going into the basement and told him I had a spider phobia, didn't like basements, etc. All lies, but anything to keep him from realizing that he was what I was afraid of. He started to get agitated about my reluctance, so I figured it would be better to just let him show me the damn basement, and then hopefully we could go outside because I really didn't know what else to do. And the basement was fairly unremarkable. Couch, TV, elliptical, until I noticed something else that gave me chills. The house was probably built in the 1990s or late 80s at the absolute earliest, but I saw a door that looked just like the heavy foam-lined door to the cold storage room in my grandma's house, the kind that only opens from the outside. It was just a smaller version of the big metal doors on commercial walk-in fridges, and it looked really out of place in this house. I absolutely would not go anywhere near that door. He opened it and told me it was their soundproof music studio. I looked inside from a few meters away, and it did look soundproof. It was about the size of a bedroom, and I could see a few guitars and amps in it. Mattress toppers on the walls, no drum kit or recording equipment that I could see, though, and he insisted that I go inside to get a better look. He was standing outside the door, motioning for me to go inside. And my God, the alarm bells were really going off now. At this point, I realized that I could actually die here if I wasn't careful. I turned around and ran up the stairs. He closed the door and followed me, asking what was wrong, acting like I was being unreasonable for not wanting to see his soundproof music studio. And that's when I realized this was way sketchier of a situation than any of my ex's nonsense, and I was freaked out. At that point, my main objective was getting out of this house. The front and back doors were both closed and locked, so I tried to run. He'd be able to get to me before I could get the locks open. The bathroom didn't have a window. The house had a convoluted floor plan that I wasn't familiar with, and it was much bigger than I was. He was the tall, lanky type, someone who could run fast even if they were out of shape and smoked a pack a day. I pretended that I was okay with hanging out in the hopes that he'd chill out a bit, and we made small talk for a few minutes. He cracked another beer, and thankfully he calmed down, and I desperately mentioned, yet again, that it was beautiful outside and suggested that we go sit in the yard while we waited. He said no and started to get agitated that I wanted to leave already. I told him that I could stay, but I'd really like to smoke a cigarette. He told me that we could smoke inside and pointed to a cereal bowl full of cigarette butts. God damn it. We sat down at the table and lit some cigarettes, and as he was smoking, he started rolling a joint, which he promptly lit as soon as his cig was done. He offered me some, and I said no thanks. He insisted, so I took the smallest puff I could. I'm a pretty seasoned weed smoker, but I pretended to cough excessively and told him that I was a novice, that was more than enough for me. And for a liar himself, he thankfully wasn't very good at picking up on the lies of others. And after we smoked, he asked if I'd like to watch a movie until his bandmates got back. I told him that I was really looking forward to spending the day outside and suggested that we go for a walk or visit the park, ideas he did not like or appreciate. At this point, I was just trying to keep as much distance as possible between us, but he stayed close enough that I could smell the beer on his breath. He grabbed me by the waist and I backed away. I asked about the barbecue food to try and change the subject, to make him think that I still believed what he was telling me. He started to get angry again and sternly reiterated that his bandmates should be home any minute. My anxiety was absolutely through the roof. I tried to calm him down again with very generic small talk. And now I don't know how I got so lucky, but the next thing that happened might have saved me. Simon went to the fridge to get another beer and pulled out an empty box. At this point, he was getting even more pissed off than before, so I went out on a limb and suggested that we go get more beer for the party, because I was out of ideas. I was terrified that suggesting once again that we leave the house would enrage him even more, but I had to try. And thankfully, though, his eyes lit up with the possibility that I might actually be down to drink with him, and he agreed. As we were walking to the liquor store, I still didn't really have a plan because I was no longer comfortable just walking away from this menace in this weirdly desolate suburb. But I was extremely relieved to be out of that house. When we got to the store, I told him that I didn't need to go inside if he was just grabbing beer, and he insisted that I had to go in. At that point, I was so stressed and frazzled that I just went with him and hoped that a good opportunity to leave would arise. Inside, he asked what kind of beer I wanted, and I reminded him that I had to work tomorrow and didn't want to drink too much. And he demanded to know what kind of beer I wanted, so I just named the first one that came to mind. We went to pay, and the cashier was kind of an a-hole, so I didn't ask for help. I probably should have, but I panicked. I regretted it, but I also remembered the times my ex told people that I was crazy so they wouldn't take me seriously. And this liquor store guy definitely seemed like he'd fall for that. I had one last idea before I took my chances running. There was a drugstore across from the liquor store. I told Simon that I had to buy a toothbrush, something that vaguely implied that I might stay over, and he eagerly agreed but tried to follow me inside. I told him that you can't bring beer into a drugstore. I have no idea if that's true, I doubt it's a law, but this drunk douchebag believed it and agreed to wait outside. And now my naive self thought maybe I could just wander around long enough and he'd get the hint or leave. But no. Half an hour later, he was still standing there staring through the window. I ended up hovering near the tills, waiting for a big group of friendly-looking people, and when they left, I followed them out and immediately told Simon to leave me alone and go home. I said it firmly and loudly enough to imply that I would make a scene if need be. Simon looked at the people getting into the car, who were now pausing and staring at us, and then he just turned around and left. Bizarrely anticlimactic, thank God, and I ran to the train station and never heard from him again. When I got home, his app profile had either blocked me or been deleted. Years later, I wish I had reported him. It bothers me to wonder if he tried it again, but made sure that the fridge was stocked first. I'm writing from the Navajo Nation Reservation, the place I've lived all my young life. I wanted to share a horrifying experience that began during what was supposed to be a peaceful walk with my old mutt, Mai. We often take this one particular route, pacing through the red rock landscapes under the shadows of buttes and mesas that have stood guard over the land for centuries. They really are beautiful. But on this particular day, we came across a river that had turned murky, unlike really anything I'd ever seen before. The water, which once mirrored the sky, was now sort of a shade of green, with an oily sheen that made me feel almost nauseous just looking at it. Mai, who was curious as always, ran down to the edge of the water and started to drink from it. I managed to pull him away just for a few seconds, but the damage was already done. And over the next few days, his behavior changed dramatically. Mahi, who was once the friendliest dog ever, began to act very strangely. He started pacing, snarling at shadows, and even snapped at me when I tried to calm him down. His eyes were wild with this sort of rage and confusion, and it was hard to tell which at any one time. Feeling overwhelmed and out of my depth, I called my friend Niz. He's an ecological expert with a PhD. And Niz has done a lot of work on the impact of industrial pollution on indigenous lands. He's the kind of guy who can walk into a forest and tell you the story of its health just by listening to the birds and observing the flora. And he spent years advocating for environmental justice for Native American communities, making him pretty much the perfect person to call in this type of crisis. Niz arrived with a very calm demeanor, bringing along his mobile equipment to analyze the immediate environment. And when we returned to that river, it was even more alarming in daylight, covered in this very oily film that seemed like it was suffocating the life out of the water. Niz took some samples and he got to work. Back at my place, his equipment revealed alarming levels of chemicals that shouldn't have been there. He explained that the chemicals could cause neurological damage, which would explain Mai's altered behavior. That night, despite all of our efforts to keep Mai calm and secure, he passed away in his sleep. And the chemicals in the water had done their damage, leading to a very peaceful end on what had become a terrifying nightmare. And losing Mai was a very terrible wake-up call, not just for me, but for our entire community. It was then that I began speaking with more people, some of which mentioned seeing suspicious activities at night near the water source. Niz and I decided to investigate. We hid near the river, and sure enough, just before midnight, a truck would come by, quiet as can be, men in these dark clothes unloading barrels, and then they began pouring substances directly into the river. Niz, with observation skills, noted down every little detail, furious at the blatant environmental crimes that were obviously happening right up close to us. And the next day, we presented these findings to the tribal council. Niz explained the scientific implications of that contamination, and the council was hesitant at first, perhaps not wanting to believe the extent of the intrusion on their land. But the strange behaviors of local animals, not just mahi, were obvious proof enough that something was very wrong. The council then called the EPA, and soon government officials were all over the land. And they confirmed what we feared. Toxic waste from some corporation had been dumped into the river, thinking no one would notice. The waste contained chemicals that could alter behavior, cause aggression, and lead to long-term health issues for the community. And the news spread pretty quickly, igniting a fire of outrage and action. The company faced fines and lawsuits and were forced to clean up the contamination. However, the process was very long, and in the meantime, we had to find alternative water sources relying on deliveries and rainwater collection. And the community started healing, setting up systems to continuously monitor our water. Niz came by more often, not just to help, but to educate our people on environmental stewardship, turning his expertise into community empowerment. And he taught us how to use traditional knowledge alongside modern science to protect our land. And we established a committee for environmental safety to watch over our natural resources. It wasn't just about water, it was about rights, our land, and the preservation of our way of life. And we learned to be vigilant, and to question things, and to look out for things, and to protect it. Now when I look at that river, it's clear again, thanks to our fight. And we fought for this, for our peace, and we'll keep fighting. Because we now understand more than ever the importance of vigilance. And I'll never forget my pup, a reminder of what we lost and why we must continue that battle. Every day as I walk by where Maui used to sleep, I think about our responsibility to the land and each other. We can't let this happen again. We need to educate the young ones about our heritage and our duty to protect it. It's not just about surviving, it's about living well with respect and dignity, on our terms, and not anyone else's. I'm a 19-year-old female living in the Pacific Northwest. A couple of months ago, I was looking for extra work because my hours at my regular job were terrible. I'm quiet, anxious, and don't have any friends, so, of course, I turned to Craigslist. I knew the site could be sketchy, but I was desperate for side gigs and hadn't had any luck as someone with no skills and not willing to do OnlyFans. One ad caught my attention. It offered $50 for someone to take photos of a property using either a camera or something above an iPhone 12. I have an iPhone 14, promising that it would only take an hour or two. I emailed the poster and soon got a text back, and the man said that I seemed like the perfect fit and invited me over that same day. What's funny is I actually made a post on r/tooafraidtoask asking if it was a dumb idea, and everyone told me to take a person with me. I didn't, and deleted that post shortly after. The house was about 20 minutes outside of town, surrounded by dense forests. It was small and run down, but nothing really raised alarms, and the man who greeted me looked like he was maybe in his mid-50s, unremarkable. He invited me inside, and the house was completely empty. No furniture, just dust and dirt. I asked where to start taking photos, but he kept dodging the question, making small talk and asking personal questions about me instead. My anxiety was building, so I kept the small talk going, but then he began staring at me intensely. I dropped my phone at one point when we eventually started taking photos throughout the house, and when he picked it up, he held on to it a little too long before giving it back. Unprompted while taking photos of the master bedroom, he brushed my face with his hand and complimented my skin. I knew it was stupid coming here, but at that point, my blood truly ran cold, and I was done making excuses in my head. I made a quick excuse to leave, something about my mom, but when I turned toward the door, he grabbed my arm. I still have the picture that I took after the ordeal of the bruises on my forearm, and it felt like it was going to get snapped in half. I had brought a small knife for self-defense, a gift from my paranoid mom who would have never have let me come here if she had known. And without thinking, I pulled it out and stabbed him in the arm. It was released with the push of a small button, and he let go, swinging at my arm with the knife, but I already was running out of the house. I got into my car and drove until I reached the gas station and my heart was calm. I called the police and explained everything. They did take it seriously, and I came in to make a report and answer some questions. They searched that property in the surrounding forest but didn't find him, and the house had turned out to be abandoned, and in the basement, they found a pack of zip ties. A report was made, but I know he's still out there. I call sometimes for updates, but it's never anything of substance. I've never told anyone about this other than the police, not even my mom. And I know typing this I sound pretty unbothered, but that was the first time anything like that has ever happened to me, and I have trouble leaving my house most days. I decided to type this out here as maybe a way of getting it off my chest since it plagues my thoughts constantly. Having recently made the decision to write a memoir, I've developed a profound interest in the art of storytelling. And this interest led me to your YouTube channel, and after discovering that you accept viewer submissions, I decided to send over a chapter for your perusal. It concerns events which took place on the Akwesasne Mohawk Reservation in upstate New York, back in 1981 when I was still an agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I graduated from Quantico in late 1980, and since all my family is based in Queens, my first choice of posting was always going to be the Bureau's Manhattan field office. Once we got the good news, my then girlfriend, now ex-wife, and I were delighted at not having to move across the country and began my tenure following the holiday period. Since I was fresh out of training, I hadn't been given a field assignment yet, and was stuck shadowing more experienced agents until the assistant director was confident that I could do my job. New agents undergo what's called the field training program, which, as I already mentioned, involves shadowing and learning from much more experienced agents. But with it typically lasting several months, I didn't expect to be given my own assignment until the summer or early fall. Yet as it transpired, the assistant director had other plans. One morning he called me into his office and asked how I was finding things thus far. And becoming an FBI agent had been my primary ambition since I first saw the taking of Pelham 123 back when I was in middle school. And so to be there in person, it really was a dream come true. And when I told him that, he just nodded and sort of thought a little, then asked the very last question that I could possibly expect him to. "Do you think you're ready for an assignment?" And the question prompted a wave of emotion. I felt honored, flattered, and, if I'm honest, a little apprehensive. But above all, I was ecstatic at the prospect of receiving an assignment so early on in my career. I knew it could make or break me, and you can bet that I was feeling the pressure of that. But I was young and foolish enough to believe that I could handle any task I was given. So, in response to the assistant director's question, I told him yes, and got my briefing there and then. The assistant director told me that he'd been reading my personnel file and had noticed the Mohawk ancestry on my mother's side. He asked me how familiar I was with Mohawk history, and after I told him that I was somewhat knowledgeable on the subject, he asked how much I knew about the St. Regis Mohawk Reservation up in Franklin County. I'd heard of it, but having grown up on the opposite side of the state and having no family there to speak of, I had to be honest and say that I'd never visited and didn't know much about the place. When I assured him that I could be up to speed in no time, he replied that he had no doubt that that was true. That wasn't why I'd been chosen for the assignment that he had in mind. The issue wasn't knowledge, it was trust. As you might already be aware, there's a lot of complexity to the issue of law enforcement on reservations. State police officers have no authority on the reservations whatsoever, meaning the job of enforcing the law comes down to tribal police forces. But every so often, when tribal police come across something a little too big for them to handle, they call in the FBI. In the case of the St. Regis Reservation, or as its denizens call it, Akwesasne, they hadn't contacted the FBI for more than 10 years, and the last time they did, it hadn't ended well. The assistant director told me that back in the late 60s, the FBI had been unable to solve a missing persons case involving a 17-year-old girl named Harper Tarbell, and the fiasco had left a very bad taste in the mouths of the Mohawk. Investigating agents concluded that Harper was a runaway, but the inhabitants of the reservation, tribal police force included, were very vocal in their belief that the girl had been abducted. They accused the FBI of not investigating the case properly, but according to the file, the geography of the St. Regis Reservation made the agents' task an extremely difficult one. You see, the St. Regis section of the reservation is in the United States, but the vast majority of the Akwesasne Mohawk territory is on the other side of the border, in Canada. That means the Canadian side of the reservation has a different police force than our side, and at least in the 60s, they made very little effort to share information, conduct joint patrols, or secure the integrity of the international border. It's probably the last part which most frustrated the two FBI agents, as it was the unofficial policy of all parties that the border remain open to anyone who called themselves a resident of the greater Akwesasne territory. But this meant that the agents had no idea whether their missing girl had run north or south, and given how often Native girls with rough home lives run away from their families, it became the Bureau's official position that Harper Tarbell was a runaway and that there was no evidence of foul play. In response, tribal police offered the agents a very sarcastic thank you and then invited them to leave the reservation at their earliest possible convenience. Once I was beginning to understand the difficulties of my potential assignment, the assistant director asked if I was sure that I wanted to take it. Before I had a chance to answer, he reassured me that I'd get all the help that I could possibly ask for when it came to the office's resources and personnel. But to use the man's own words, "You're the face of this thing, no one else." To make a good impression with the locals, they wanted to send a Mohawk, and that Mohawk was me. That way, when I told people that I was there because I cared, and I wasn't just there for a paycheck, it would come off as much more sincere, and it needed to come off sincere because this was a very important and very sensitive case. It was a daunting prospect, and I don't feel nearly so confident once the precariousness of the situation became clear. But it still presented a golden opportunity to get a step up on the career ladder, and very early on, too. And so I took it. It was about a 6-hour drive from Manhattan to a place called Hogansburg, the largest town in the reservation, at least on the American side, and the location of Tribal Police HQ. When I arrived, I met with the chief of police at a diner across the precinct called the Bear's Den. They did an amazing steak hash, which was much appreciated after that long journey, and as we ate, the chief gave me a brief introduction to the reservation and its people. He really talked the place up, and while it isn't unusual for someone to love where they're from, the chief said his praise had a purpose. He was telling me that so when I opened up that file and read what had happened there, I'd remembered that there were good, hard-working, level-headed people on that reservation that merely wanted to get to the bottom of a very grisly crime. Again, this was a somewhat daunting introduction, but he was absolutely right to warn me. Because when I got back to the $3 a night motel that I was staying in and read what was in that file, it made my blood run cold. Less than a week before my arrival, one of the reservation's many farmers woke up before dawn and walked out into his fields to begin his morning work. Then, as he's feeding some of his animals, he sees a figure walking up his pathway in the early morning. It's a young girl, 11 years old to be exact, and as she's getting closer, the farmer realizes that from head to toe, she was covered in blood. Being of advanced age, the farmer said it quite literally almost scared him to death. He thought it was a spirit come to take him to the other place, and he was shaking in his boots right up until she asked him, in plain but very accented English, to help her. And the farmer rushes back inside to his house and calls 911. Then, by the time he runs back outside, the girl's lying in the dirt, drifting in and out of consciousness. And the last thing she says before she passes out for a whole 12 hours is that she came from the river, meaning she walked just over 3 miles, soaked to the bone and freezing cold, before collapsing in our farmer's pathway. The paramedics rushed to the young girl's aid and then drove her straight to the medical clinic there in Hogansburg for life-saving treatment. And then once they got her there, they realized all that blood wasn't even hers. Apart from a few abrasions here and there was barely a scratch on her. Then after hearing that the girl mentioned the river, the tribal police enlisted the help of the reservation's paramedics in scouring the banks of the nearby St. Regis River, particularly the section nearest to our farmer's humble patch of dirt. And it didn't take long for them to find out where all that blood had come from. Out there on the riverbank, hanging in the trees, were the mutilated bodies of 5 men. All had been disemboweled, their entrails hanging 4 or 5 feet to the ground from where they'd been impaled on broken branches or nestled grotesquely among the beams. Once the tribal police had gone about analyzing the crime scene and transporting the victims' bodies for secure storage, the chief of police stopped into the medical center to talk to that girl. She was awake, and the chief tried his best to pry any information he could from her, but she was in no condition to discuss her ordeal, and she only made it through 4 or 5 questions before she suffered a complete nervous breakdown. She said her name was Sarah, that she was 11 years old and she was from Quebec City. But when the chief asked her what had happened down by the river, she started to lock up. And then, with tears welling up in her eyes, she told the chief, "It was something in the river. Something in the river killed them." And after that, she was inconsolable and was in no fit state to be interviewed again for another couple of days. Before then, the tribal police got a preliminary analysis back from the Franklin County Coroner's Office, and the results were interesting to say the least. Each of the bodies had been heavily mutilated, so much so that the exact causes of death were impossible to determine. In each of their mouths, the coroner found a small amount of what was later determined to be ceremonial pipe tobacco. Pipe tobacco is used by many First Nations people for spiritual, cultural, and ceremonial purposes. It's used in prayer, where the smoke from pipe carries prayers to the spiritual realm, and it's also used at various coming-of-age ceremonies, or even weddings and funerals. But pipe tobacco serves another purpose, that of purification and spiritual restoration. And the significance of its presence in the victims' mouths wasn't immediately obvious, but as one of the tribal police officers told me, it was most likely there to banish the victims' restless spirits and prevent them from clinging to the land. Obviously, at that stage, the tribal police knew they had something big on their hands, but whether or not the case could be handled internally hinged on what the little girl from Quebec had to say once she was finally able to talk. They had her staying in the medical center in Hogansburg, and although she hadn't said much in the meantime, her condition spoke quite a bit. Some of the tribal police officers had this idea that maybe the whole thing was some kind of camping trip gone wrong, that maybe a group of old friends had been out canoeing on the river, and that one of them had snapped. When they got the news that the girl was showing signs of malnourishment, that kind of played into the officers' theory. The group were canoeing in the river, they got lost, ran out of food, and then snap. One of the group flies off the handle, attacks everyone, then little Sarah somehow escapes in the ensuing chaos. But once the girl was ready to talk again, she turned that whole theory on its head. The moment the chief of tribal police heard little Sarah was talking again, he rushed over to the medical center with one of his officers to take her statement. But upon their arrival, they were shocked to hear that the men that she was with were not her family, or friends of her family, or anything like that at all. At some point over the previous few weeks, she wasn't exactly sure when, Sarah had been snatched off the streets in Quebec City. The men that she was with had abducted her and were in the process of transporting her someplace when the thing came out of the river and saved her. The chief pressed her as much as possible on what exactly came out of the river, but Sarah didn't know. She'd been blindfolded and placed into some kind of large sack prior to the first leg of the journey, but had been removed from the bag and placed into some kind of boat. And the boat had been driven for some undetermined period of time, then it stopped and she was guided into the shallows. But as soon as her feet touched the water, the men escorting her became alarmed, began yelling, and then gunfire began to erupt just a few feet from her. She said that there was a lot of gunfire, so much it almost sounded like one solid wall of noise hitting her ears, making her deaf. The men who'd abducted her tried to kill the thing that attacked them, screaming, cursing, and yelling as it tore them apart, and in the chaos as it unfolded, she pulled off her blindfold and escaped into the darkness of the early morning. Sarah said that she had no idea where she was or where she was headed, but as dawn started to creep onto the horizon, she saw an old farmhouse and began walking towards it. And once word got out, that's about the time folks started talking about the spirit of the river. Many native cultures have a myth surrounding river gods or river spirits, but for the most part, these spirits are passive and unconcerned by the affairs of man. However, once news of the girl's kidnap made its way around the reservation, it became clear that many believed that the spirit of the river had felt young Sarah's pain and had decided to do something about it. This is especially true after two aspects of the case were leaked by an unidentified member of the tribal police. Firstly, the news that ceremonial tobacco had been found in the mouths of the victims only strengthened people's belief that something supernatural was at play. But it was the second detail that really creeped out the reservation's residents. By that point, around a dozen tribal police officers had observed the scene of the crime, as had several members of emergency medical services. All of them confirmed that covering the riverbank near the location of those bodies were a ton of dead river fish. There were brown trout, walleyes, muskies, panfish, all lying there like some lifeless carpet made of shimmering scales. And just like with the ceremonial tobacco, their presence only seemed to reinforce the idea that the kidnappers were killed by the spirit of the river. But to me, the explanation seemed much more simpler. You see, my father was a Vietnam veteran, and although he hadn't talked much about what he did during the war, there was something that he once told me that I never forgot. He said the Viet Cong were master ambushers and never attacked a patrol when they expected to be attacked. They waited until what my dad called moments of transition, when his platoon was least prepared, and that's when they attacked. For example, the VC would choose to hit my dad's unit during helicopter departures, during sentry changes in the middle of the night, or perhaps their favorite, during river crossings. Whoever ambushed Sarah's abductors did so during a moment of transition, and had done so with such effectiveness that all 5 victims never stood a chance. I put this theory to the chief of police, who, to an extent, agreed with my analysis of the crime scene. There was just one problem. During the preliminary examination of the bodies, the Franklin County coroner saw no sign of entry or exit wounds on any of the bodies, meaning, if they had been ambushed, it wasn't with any kind of firearm. There were, however, plenty of indications that the men had been killed using a sharp or bladed instrument. But if that was the case, how had a group of men armed with nothing but knives managed to best a group of 5 firearm-toting people smugglers? And the chief also mentioned that the reservation had a kind of small-town mentality to it. Even though it was spread over a wide area and included multiple small towns and villages, everyone knew everyone else's business. Tribal police had also issued an appeal for information, and with the level of trust between the force and their people being so high, the fact that no one came forward was very concerning. They never had the problem before. Someone always came through with a tip or some information, especially if it was for the good of the reservation. Outsiders were pretty focused to exploit the place's legal loopholes, but the reservation's denizens were just as focused to keep that from happening. So the fact that no one came forward seemed to be proof that no one knew anything, which again, for a place like a reservation, was deeply troubling. And it was around here that the tribal police hit their investigative brick wall, so to speak, and after some debate, they contacted the FBI's New York field office and requested assistance. By the time I arrived, the abducted Canadian girl had been returned to her parents in Quebec City for what I can only assume was a very happy reunion. I had dinner with the chief of tribal police, took the case file back to my motel room, then the next morning, I drove over to the precinct to talk with the chief and his officers. The first thing I did, in an attempt to reestablish trust between the Bureau and the tribal police, was ask them where and how we could assist them in their investigation. I wasn't there to take over and shove them aside, like you see in almost every other police drama on television. I was there to supercharge whatever they were doing with the Bureau's deep pockets and fancy equipment. They seemed appreciative, albeit a little skeptical of the help that I had to offer them, but they were not without requests. First off, the coroner over in Franklin County was so understaffed that they couldn't give the tribe a definitive date for the completion of all 5 autopsies. Given they needed the results to advance the investigation, the first thing I could do was help expedite the autopsies. The second thing I could do was get some FBI forensics guys to look over the crime scene again, as all they'd be able to do thus far was look it over with the naked eye. Don't get me wrong, they'd done a real good job with what little they had, but they needed divers for the river, and they needed someone to figure out who the hell their victims actually were, which would involve setting up a direct line of communication with the police up in Quebec and Ontario. It was a lot of work, but I had the backing of the Bureau, and within days, I was able to deliver the first result. After a phone call back to HQ, 2 forensic pathologists from the New York field office drove up to the coroner's office in Malone. The folks there were only too happy to let them do their jobs for them, and it meant that we had our autopsy results by late afternoon that same day. Preliminary examinations hadn't found a single verifiable gunshot wound on any of the bodies, but the autopsy results showed that they were riddled with them. One body had almost 30 cavitations running through his torso alone, meaning almost 30 bullets had punched through his chest and stomach before exiting through the flesh of his back. The sheer volume and devastation of this gunfire suggested that either the smugglers had been attacked by a large group of lightly armed men, or by a much smaller group armed with high-powered machine guns. To the tribal police, both explanations proved hard to swallow. They couldn't believe a large group of armed men had been running around the reservation without word getting back to them, and when it came to heavy machine guns, no one on the reservation had that kind of firepower. Then, when the forensic analysis of the scene came in, it only sort of deepened the mystery. And so, remember all those dead fish that had creeped everyone out so much? The ceremonial pipe tobacco in the victims' mouths were one thing, but how did we expect to explain all those dead fish lining the shore? Well, the mystery of all those dead fish was solved in tandem with the mystery of where the smuggler's boat had gotten to. It was at the bottom of the river, complete with a few sacks stuffed with bullet-punctured bags of Afghan heroin. All of those fish had been swimming around the boat, breathing in uncut heroin that had been leaching into the water and then floating to the surface and toward the riverbank, dead as doornails. But what investigators couldn't understand was why there was a single 7.92 by 57 Mauser shell casing a rare old pattern bullet first introduced prior to World War I, lying among a sea of 9mm and .45. The discovery of the heroin raised the question if the murders were committed by a rival group, or if the incident itself was some kind of drug deal gone wrong. This theory was reinforced when Ontario police reached out to confirm that multiple Canadian smuggling operations used the waterways of the Akwesasne territory to transport goods across the border to the United States, and then naturally, their direct competitions sometimes led to confrontations. But there was something about the presence of the pipe tobacco in their mouths that made me think that there was much more to it than that. Some of the tribal police suggested it could have been placed there to throw investigators off the scent and make them focus on the local Mohawk rather than on the international smuggling outfits. I could understand making an example of them by mutilating the bodies. But why go to the trouble of procuring ceremonial tobacco, and why bother to place it in such an exact spot as opposed to tossing a handful of it over the bodies once they'd been cut up and hung? No. To me, it was no decoy or distraction. It had been done with intent and forethought, meaning the killers were on the reservation. Then when it came to the question of who might be motivated enough to do such a thing, I knew damn sure who I wanted to talk to first. Before I continue, I feel like this is the right time to explain something very important. In some people's vision of an ideal world, the FBI wouldn't investigate a case wherein 5 smugglers of child captives were murdered, with their prisoner having escaped without a scratch. But there's a reason vigilante justice is illegal in this country. From the perspective of an investigator, we had no idea who these people were. Sure, a few of them could have been people smugglers, but all of them? And what if that little girl Sarah from Quebec wasn't the only child on board the boat that night? There could be bodies still unaccounted for, and vulnerable, trafficked individuals could have been murdered along with their kidnappers in a case of mistaken identity. That's why we had to get to the bottom of what had happened, and why we couldn't just say, oh well, scratch 5 scumbags, and then clock out early for cold beers and shrimp cocktails. The first and only person on my list of people to talk to was Wolf Tarbell, the father of the missing Harper Tarbell, who disappeared 15 years prior. He was a disabled veteran of World War II, living alone off his army pension on a piece of untilled farmland his family had owned for generations. At first, after limping out of his home with the use of a cane, he refused to answer any of my questions, and frankly, I completely understood why. But I told him not only had I brought news that'd vindicate his claims of his daughter's abduction, but there was a chance that we could make the men that took her face justice for their crime. And after that, he warmed up to me considerably and invited me into his home. The first thing Mr. Tarbell did after I walked inside was show me a picture of his missing daughter. He told me that he thought of her every single day, and her memory was the only thing that got him out of bed every morning. He asked me if I'd ever lost somebody like that, and I said no. He said he hoped that I never had to know what it felt like. And then and only then did he agree to talk about the smugglers. As it went, Mr. Tarbell had conducted considerable research into the cross-border smuggling networks of the Akwesasne. A series of competing factions smuggled cigarettes, drugs, firearms, and even people back and forth across the border, and Mr. Tarbell was quite certain that it was one of these factions which abducted his daughter. He obviously didn't have any concrete proof, and he had no idea where his daughter had been taken, or even if she was still alive. But if he knew it had to be one of those groups, and he was only too willing to help me if it meant seeing them in handcuffs. And I thanked him for everything he told me, said I'd take his advice regarding better communication with the cops on the Canadian side of the border, and then made my way to the Hogansburg police precinct to tell the chief what I'd learned. He didn't seem surprised Mr. Tarbell had spent so much time fixated on the subject, but he was surprised that he'd taken the time to talk to me. The chief claimed Wolf Tarbell had once said that the next FBI man who stepped foot onto his property would be buried on it, so the fact that I even made it off his land alive was something of a miracle. Over the days that followed, myself and the officers of the tribal police tried to build a picture of the regional smuggling operation, and we primarily achieved this after securing the cooperation of police departments up in Quebec and Ontario, who explained it had been a problem on their side for quite some time. The transnational nature of the territory meant that it had always been an issue, but from the early 70s onwards, cross-border narcotics and people smuggling had become a huge problem for communities on both sides of the US-Canadian border, and that made for one hell of a day's work, and by the end of it, we had 2 separate link charts on 2 separate corkboards, one for English-speaking groups and the other for the French-Canadian groups. Most seemed to specialize in either drugs or firearms, rarely both, but the ones we were interested in were to the ones that transported people. But to our frustration, they were much, much harder to pin down because cases involving human trafficking were much less common. And like I said, that made for a tough day, so before I went to my motel room, I stopped by the Bear's Den Diner for more of their steak hash. And it was close to closing time and I was the only person in there, but the owner seemed only too happy to make me his final customer of the evening. Once I'd finished eating, he brought me a cup of coffee on the house. He'd heard about what had happened down by the river and figured that I must be one of the out-of-town cops come to help solve the case. I told him with powers of deduction like that, he should have been a detective, and after what I'm sure was a very polite return of laughter, he asked how the investigation was going. And I said it was going okay, permitting a few speed bumps, and that when all was said and done, it might make a real difference in terms of putting a dent in local crime. The diner's owner then said he doubted that very much on account of the incompetence of the local police force. And out of courtesy, I just asked him what he meant by that. And as I sipped my free coffee, he explained that sometimes the local cops didn't respond to calls at all. One night, just a week prior or so, the owner of the diner had taken a bathroom trip in the middle of the night. He hadn't been keeping regular as he'd like to in his old age, so while it was a relief to have nature finally calling, he remained atop the old porcelain throne for quite some time before he properly finished his business. But during that period, in dead silence of the winter night, he thought that he heard a loud burst of gunfire way off in the distance, and then another, and then another. He said he wasn't completely sure what he'd heard at the time, but the next day when news of the murders swept the town, he called the tribal police to file a report on what he'd heard. The officer that he had spoken to said that he'd make a note of the call and then inform the chief at the first available opportunity, but he never got a return call. When I asked the chief why I hadn't been informed of this, he said it was the first that he was hearing of it and that an officer, Tyler Wynn, had been manning the desk that day. Wynn, on the other hand, offered little more than a weak apology and said that he'd been tired following the extra early start that day. I didn't see it as too much of a setback or a missed opportunity or anything, but I did think that it was odd that an officer would neglect to record something of such significance. The next few days were quite slow, with only minute progress here and there, thanks to calls from departments up in Canada. But then, a sudden break in the case sent everyone scrambling. We got a call from an antique firearms dealer over in New Hampshire who, having heard the press release we put out regarding the automatic weapons used in the Riverside murders, had reached out to the FBI to report an unusual sale. His antique dealership specialized in weaponry and equipment from World War II, and while he made a few bucks here and there from antique weapon sales, he made a lot of money selling what you might call historical ammunition, or stuff they don't make anymore. About 3 or 4 months before the murders, he gets a phone order for an entire case of 7.92 by 57 Mauser ammo, and not blank rounds either, live ones. And if you remember, one of the shell casings found at the scene of the crime had been of this exact same rare caliber. The antiques dealer used to do a lot of business with reenactors, you know the kind. They dress up in old uniforms and then go running around a field pretending to shoot at each other and then pretending to die. They always needed a whole bunch of old-fashioned ammunition for their reenactments, so the guy made a lot of money off of it, and whenever he sold actual live rounds of 7.92 by 57, it was only ever a few boxes to target shooters, not whole cases. Just a few days before the murders, when the guy came to pick the ammo up, He arrived in a car with New York plates, walked with a limp, and although he never said it out loud, our antiques dealer was for damn sure that the guy was a veteran. It was Wolf Tarbell. It had to be. As soon as I got off the phone with the antiques dealer, which was fairly late in the evening, I called the chief of police and then arranged for us to pay Mr. Tarbell a visit the following morning. Since he was now considered a person of interest, I didn't want to tip him off that we were planning on stopping by. Yet, little did I know, he wouldn't have been able to come to the phone anyway. When myself and the chief arrived at his home the next morning, Wolf Tarbell's front door was wide open, and when I called out for him, I didn't get a reply. The chief and I drew our sidearms and then crept into Tarbell's house, not quite knowing what to expect, but knowing that it was going to be bad. Then, when we walked into the man's kitchen, we found him. I'd seen the crime photos from the river murders already, and what was left of Wolf Tarbell looked exactly like the remains in those photographs. He was all torn up, butchered almost beyond recognition. Someone had taken his head and then placed it horizontally on a kitchen counter. Tarbell's jaw was a little slack, and inside his mouth, I could see a clump of something dark and damp behind his front teeth. It was ceremonial pipe tobacco, the same kind that had been found in the mouths of the victims by the river. The chief called for backup using his patrol car's radio, and within the hour, his officers had locked down the crime scene and forensics were en route. But as the first of the chief's officers arrived, we got word that Officer Wynn had failed to show up to work that day, which, given the recent spike of murders, was obviously very concerning. Tyler Wynn was the same slow but well-meaning officer who failed to log the call that one time. The chief said that he lived with his mother in a small home just outside of Hogansburg, but when the chief and I stopped by, he wasn't there either. As the chief asked his mother, who was a very warm and very cooperative older lady, where she thought that her son might be, I found my eyes starting to kind of wander around the room. Mrs. Wynn had hung framed pictures of her family on just about every visible surface, including plenty of her police officer's son, Tyler. I got kind of a kick out of getting to see him grow up in fast motion, as the photos ranged from baby pictures to elementary school age to late high school and graduation. But there was one picture in particular that really caught my eye, and that's because I recognized both of the photos' two subjects. It looked like it was taken during some kind of winter formal and showed a sophomore or junior year aged Tyler standing with a young lady who looked very, very familiar. At the next opportunity, I politely interrupted the chief and Mrs. Wynn to ask who the girl in the photograph was, and a sad look came over her face before she told me, "That's Harper Tarbell. Tyler was real sweet on her back in his high school days. The two dated, even went to a dance together, and he was heartbroken when she went missing." The chief and I were stunned, but him more so because in almost 10 years of working with Officer Wynn, he never once mentioned having dated the missing Tarbell girl. But that wasn't the only odd thing that the chief had noticed about Officer Wynn. On the night of the river murders, Wynn had radioed into HQ claiming that he'd followed a bunch of outsiders back to some kind of illegal alcohol still that they had set up on the edge of the reservation. Because he was still on the move, he only gave a rough idea of his location and direction, but then suddenly, he starts yelling about how they'd spotted their tail and had opened fire on him, then he drops off his radio entirely. Every tribal officer on duty, and even some that were off duty, go roaring off towards Wynn's last known location, and when I asked where that was, the chief told me that it was just about as far away from the scene of the river murders as it was possible to be, and still be inside the reservation. The only trouble was, when they arrived in the area in question and started scouring it for any sign of Wynn and the trigger-happy bootleggers, they can't find hide nor hair of either party, and they only find Wynn much later on back at that station, claiming that he outran those gunmen and saved his own skin. The chief didn't tell me all that until we were back in his car, and we were on our way to the fishing shack Wynn's mother claimed that he liked to frequent. She claimed it's where she'd look if she was in charge of looking for him, and she was right. Inside of that rickety old fishing shack, the mutilated corpse of Officer Tyler Wynn was spread all over the wooden walls and floor, and I'm sure by this stage, I don't have to tell you what had been stuffed into his mouth. Also present inside the shack was a little plastic baggie containing all the 7.92 by 57 shell casings that were missing from the scene of the rivers, all except for one, of course. And the question of what they'd been fired from was answered following a thorough search of Wolf Tarbell's property. After being wounded during the Battle of Bastogne, Wolf Tarbell returned home with more than just a Purple Heart. For some reason, he was allowed to keep the rifle that he'd fought with upon his discharge, and after registering it with the tribal police, it took a prideful place above his mantle. But what the army didn't know is that the old wounded wolf had brought home another weapon with him, broken down into pieces and concealed among his belongings. He reassembled it in his basement when he got home, and that's where it stayed for more than 35 years, an almost mint-condition German-made Maschinengewehr 42, more commonly known as the MG42. We had an idea of who had provided the weapon. We had an idea of who had pulled the trigger. We also had an idea of why our killer had pulled the trigger, seeing as his childhood sweetheart had apparently been abducted by the same organization the victims were members of. But what we couldn't work out, what I've never been able to work out, is who killed Wynn and Tarbell, and why. The only other detail of the case, the final detail before we hit such a great investigative brick wall that we were forced to abandon the investigation, was this. Just a few days after we pulled that German machine gun out of Wolf's basement and were recovering the missing ballistic evidence from Tyler Wynn's fishing shack, 3 tiny bodies washed up on the banks of the St. Regis River, about 9 or 10 miles downstream. Little Sarah hadn't been the only kidnapped child on the smugglers' boat that night. There had been 3 more, 2 Canadian children and 1 American. All 3 had been riddled with those antique bullets bought by the late Wolf Tarbell. I figured that when they realized what they'd done, Tarbell and Wynn had to make it look like something it wasn't. But they couldn't have been working alone. It's impossible that they were working alone, because if they were, then who the hell did the exact same brutal thing to them in order to ensure their eternal silence? I might be Mohawk on my mother's side, but I don't subscribe to beliefs that involve things I can't see or touch. I don't believe any kind of spirit was responsible for what had happened to those people, be it the smugglers, their child captives, or those who killed them. But I do believe that there's someone out there, maybe they're still on the reservation, maybe not, who out of blind hatred or lust for revenge did something truly unforgivable. And I'll live the rest of my life in regret that I couldn't bring them to justice. Maybe the story of why I couldn't bring them to justice could make for another chapter of my memoir, but I have no doubt that it'd make for a much sadder and much less unsettling kind of story than this one. In August of 2023, I was in my junior year at a trade school in Sumeru County for graphic design. A sophomore named James noticed that I wasn't getting dropped off at our home school like he was, and one day he offered to drive me home. I didn't know this kid well. I had spoken to him a few times, but we weren't friends. I told him that my mom prefers to meet people before letting me ride in a random person's car, especially a guy's. At the time, I was 18, so I also mentioned that if he got into a wreck, I would be legally responsible as the adult in the car. And after that, he didn't really bother me much. We still talked occasionally, and it was clear that he wasn't neurotypical, but things didn't get creepy until my senior year. We exchanged numbers because I sometimes helped him with homework that he didn't fully understand, and I also recommended some horror channels on YouTube, like Reddit stories, creepypasta readings, or channels that covered disturbing videos such as Hannah the Horrible, Nick Crowley, and Nexpo. And within a month, he somehow found my home address, and I never told him where I lived, and he got dropped off way earlier than I did. The way our homeschool system worked was that all students on the west side of Fontaine heading into Solani went to one middle school and high school, while students from East Fontaine going into Layu went to a different high school. I never told this kid where I lived, not even a rough area, and at this point I started documenting everything, no matter how big or small. Over the next few months, if I fell asleep on the bus, he would tap my headphones, snap them against my ears, kick my legs, shake me, or call my phone just to force me to talk to him. And in April, he asked me to prom, and I repeatedly told him that I was not interested. He tried to manipulate me into going, so I ended up lying and saying that I had a family event that day. After that, I reported him to the principal for harassing and shaming people into going to prom, and he gave me the most insincere apology ever. It was clear that he had been forced to do it. The next day, he called me and asked if my sister drove a red car or worked at the Sangonomiya coffee house, and I quickly told him no and blocked his number. I then went to administration, bringing up the fact that this kid had been calling me to ask if I had gone to Dollar General, if I was at work, or if I was at home. He also told me disturbing thoughts about wanting to kill his mom's boyfriend, describing how he wanted to smash his teeth in. He smacked his phone against the bus window, tried to manipulate me into calling him while he was having a panic attack, and rant about how our math teacher needed to be gutted because she was overweight. He went on a misogynistic rant about how fat women are ugly and horrible vessels for producing babies, and she wasn't even overweight due to a poor diet. She had a medical condition that caused a buildup of estrogen. And the worst moment was when he lost his AirPods case and had a full-on meltdown. He aggressively stomped on his AirPods, foamed at the mouth, and threw a tantrum in pure rage. I reported everything to the principal and the school liaison, and instead of listening, they yelled at me for an hour, accusing me of being mean to a kid on the spectrum. I thought that he just played Overwatch. They even justified his actions by saying that my information, my mother's information, and my sister's information were all public anyway. At this point, I started having a panic attack and called my mom, and I was literally vomiting into the trash can in the conference room. My mom was pissed. She told me to call the sheriff's office as soon as I got home. The sheriff actually went to this kid's house and warned him to knock it off, or else I had every right to file stalking and harassment charges. The 180 Women's Shelter later confirmed that what the principal and liaison did was disgusting and dangerous. And so far I haven't seen him, and I still have his number blocked. Hopefully I never see that little idiot again. And to James, if by some chance you ever see this post, stay away from me and my sister. I hope your future commanding officer finds out about all of this. Oh, and that's right. This guy wants to join the army. As this was several years ago, a 35-year-old blonde, white, petite Italian-American with barely 2-year-old twins. And now I may be biased, but my boy/girl twins are exceptionally cute. Weirdly though, they don't even look related. My son in particular got a lot of attention due to his strawberry blonde hair and giant blue eyes. So I head out to Target with my twinsies, parking slightly far from the main entrance because I like to be close to where you can return the carts, and there weren't a ton of carts in this row. As I'm getting out, another couple who parked near me and I exchange smiles. Clearly their son is the same age as my kids. The dad is a bear of a man, huge with a beard for days and arms like tree trunks. And as I'm walking around Target, looking at all the things we don't need, I vaguely notice two couples who seem to be in a lot of the same areas as me. They aren't speaking English, and if I had to guess, I'd say probably Russian, but I couldn't really tell. Now fast forward, I get in line behind one of the couples. My daughter is in the seat part of the cart, and my son is in the wide open part. And out of nowhere, the woman from the couple behind me is all up in my cart and personal space. Meanwhile, the couple in front of me, after paying, doesn't move out of the way. Weird. Move over, guys. What are you doing? And then, the woman behind me leans completely over my cart, placing herself between me and my son, and I have no idea what she's doing, still. It seems like her main objective is to block my eye line from him. I have my hands on my daughter, but I can't even see my son. She's a big lady and she is way too close to my kids. She is leaning so far over my cart that her body is practically resting on both sides of it. Again, I can't even see my child anymore, who, up until 2 minutes ago, was less than 10 inches away from me. I asked her to back up when she started inching closer, but she just responded in her native language. I gestured to show her what I meant, and I repeatedly asked her to please move, excuse me, etc. And it was obvious that I was trying to get her away from my children. Even if you don't speak the same language, it's pretty damn clear what I was trying to imply, and she just blatantly ignores me. I'm trying to lean around her to grab my son and throw him onto the conveyor belt just to get him away from this couple. Seriously, what are they trying to do here? And she refuses to move, and I can't get to my son, and this starts to go on for several minutes. We're not even checked out yet because I have items in my cart that I can't reach. I'm also blocked in on the other side by the other couple who are standing completely on top of me. At this point, I am full on yelling at the woman to get the F away from my kid. Finally, I grab my cart and smash it as hard as I can into her, and she starts yelling at me, and backs up just enough for me to grab my son, who is now hysterical. The 16-year-old cashier was useless, even though I was screaming at her to call security the entire time. Then the bear from earlier sees everything happening and rushes over with his family. He shoves the other couple away from me, and we ditch all my attempted purchases. He escorts me and my twins back to our cars safely, and he and his wife even followed me for a bit onto the highway just to make sure that we weren't being followed. So to the tourists at Target who attempted to, I don't even know what you were attempting, you raised all my mama bear red flags, and you're lucky I didn't smash my keys into your face because that was my next move, coming at you. I stupidly decided to get gas at 11 p.m. one night because I hadn't made time before work. As I'm pulling up to the gas station, there are a couple of cars at the pumps, which make me feel somewhat relieved and safer going in. But I was wrong. I go inside to pay the clerk since I'm using cash, and as I'm heading back to the pump to fill up, most of the cars leave, except for one truck parked 2 pumps away from me. I get into my car to wait for the gas to fill and start scrolling on my phone. Suddenly, I see this guy walking suspiciously around the front of my car, and I glance up to see what he's doing. Unfortunately, we make eye contact. He asks if I have any change for gas, and I shake my head. No, sorry. And he responds,
"Okay, that's cool. Hey, do you want me to remove your gas pump for you?"
And I quickly respond,
"I'm good, thanks."
At this point, my tank is full and he knows it, and he acts fidgety and walks away behind my car. I'm trying not to glare back too obviously, but I subtly am looking around trying to figure out where he is. I don't want to make it obvious how terrified I am. In my head, I'm thinking, how do I leave with him still around my car? He's out of sight now, and the lot is empty and I'm waiting for another car to pull up. 5 minutes pass and nothing. My fight or flight response is just kicking my head in, and it's freezing outside and I haven't started my car yet because the pump is still in. I have no idea where this guy went. Finally, I see him walking towards his truck, but instead of getting in, he's just sort of lingering around it. And the second his back is turned, I go for it. I remove the pump, and as soon as he notices, he quickly starts approaching me again.
"Oh, hey, you're really beautiful,"
he says, still walking toward me. And I nod quickly, but subtly, I put the gas cap back on, and then he says,
"I don't look like a serial killer, do I?"
with this crazed look in his eyes. Like, yeah, bro, you actually do. And at that point, I bolted to my car and just sped off. So this happened just last week. I live alone in a small college town, although I'm not a student or a faculty member. My apartment is in a duplex on a residential street just a few blocks from campus, which most of the students have left for their winter break. Things get very quiet when they're not around. Late Wednesday night, I woke up to a disturbing sound outside. It was someone crying, but not in a normal way. This was more like delirious wailing. The person didn't sound grief-stricken or panicked, and there were no cries for help. Otherwise, I'd probably have gone outside cautiously to check things out. And this sounded more like someone doing an impression of a ghost, but being a little too convincing. A sort of woo, ooh, ah, over and over. Not a pleasant way to wake up, I'll be honest. I got up and looked out the window but didn't see anyone, and I couldn't tell where the sound was coming from. After a few minutes, the wailing grew distant and things got quiet. I went back to sleep, a little unsettled. Thursday night rolled around and I went to bed as usual, wondering if I'd hear anything again. And sure enough, I was awakened a few hours later, but this time the sound was completely different. At first I wondered if there had been a heavy snowfall because I heard what sounded like the edge of a shovel scraping the sidewalk. It was very rhythmic. 2 plodding footsteps followed by a long and drawn-out scraping. Thud, thud, scrape, thud, thud, scrape. I got up and looked out the window, where I saw no snow but a dense fog and a woman across the street. It took me a minute to tell if she was wearing some strange hat, but then I realized that the hat was her hair. It was long, down to her waist, and completely filthy and matted, bunched up into a single mass that looked like a gigantic glistening hairball. The woman was standing with her shoulders hunched forward and her arms crossed behind her back like a figure skater or dancer. And she was doing an unusual sort of dance, where she would take 2 heavy stomps and then glide as if though she were on ice skates. But there was no ice. I couldn't tell how she was gliding so gracefully and effortlessly across the pavement. It was almost hypnotic to watch because she appeared to be elderly and frail. But she could spin, glide, and maintain balance on a level that would be hard for me to keep up with. And each time she would glide, I'd hear the scrape sound of her shoe against the pavement. There was no additional steps to the dance, just the rhythmic stomp, stomp, glide, headed in one direction before twirling around and doing the same steps in the other. After a few minutes, she stopped and then stooped down like a runner at the starting line, dramatically leaning forward with her fingertips lightly touching the ground. She stayed that way for a good minute or two, and it was a very unsettling thing to see in the shadows and fog. Then she slowly stood up, turned facing away from me, and got up on her very tiptoes with her long, skinny arms outstretched. Then she broke into a rapid tiptoeing motion that professional ballerinas do. In my mind, I heard that classic cartoon sound effect that plays when a character scampers away. And without a sound, she danced into the fog, and I haven't seen or heard anything from her since. This happened approximately 10 years ago, around 2015 to 2016. I was living with someone at the time who worked an opposite schedule as me. He worked graveyard shift and I worked during the day. So when I was getting up and getting ready to leave for work, he was just coming home. On the nights during the week, I obviously would be at home by myself. And one night during the week, I was feeling especially lonely and my favorite toy unfortunately broke and died. So I decided to drive downtown to the 24-hour adult store to buy another one. The town I live in is a mid-sized suburban town filled with mostly residential areas. The main downtown area was essentially one small area on the way to the freeway, and my apartment was 10 minutes away. I pulled into the parking lot behind the adult store. The parking lot was dark and had multiple entries all around that led to the bars and restaurants as well as the store. After parking my car, I walked towards the entrance of the store, which was on the street, and to do so, I had to walk towards the driveway that I came in to park, and upon walking to the entrance, I noticed a man standing by himself smoking a cigarette. It was 1 a.m. and not normal to just see only one person standing by themselves there, though I figured he was one of the patrons from one of the bars on the block taking a cigarette break. And as I walked passing him, he says, "Hi," to which I responded with a very quiet hi, but didn't make eye contact with him. And upon passing him, I had a better look at his appearance. He had a shaved head, wore a long white t-shirt with shorts hanging past his knees, and he had a pair of sneakers accompanied with some tube socks that covered his shins. This is not unusual to see in my town, but I was more concerned that he was sitting by himself and instantly took an interest in me as I walked past him. After passing him and continuing to walk to the store, I saw out of the corner of my eye the man proceeding to follow behind me. When I say follow, I don't mean he coincidentally was walking behind me. He immediately followed right behind me as soon as I passed him, making a point to maintain the same walking speed. I did not know this man's intentions, but a man by himself that late at night is a recipe for trouble. And as I looked down the dark and empty street, I weighed out my options of where to go. Initially, I thought, keep walking so he doesn't know that you're going to the adult store. But since it was 1 a.m. and there was no one on the street, I thought that to be probably more dangerous. Then I thought, just go in one of the bars. But then I thought that would give him an easier introduction to approach me. So then I realized my best bet was to continue into the store where I knew it was well lit and people could see me. I proceeded to shop for what I came there for, and the man entered the store behind me but hung out at the front of the store so as not to look like he was following me around. He wasn't even pretending to shop. He literally just sat at the front waiting. And as I was shopping, I heard the man make sort of a sound, to which I ignored, and he wasn't getting the message, and he continued to make this S sound as I continued to shop without noticing. And eventually I walked up to the cashier, who was completely oblivious to what was going on, and I tried to whisper to the cashier, "Do you know what that man, or does he work here?" The cashier asked me to repeat what I was saying, and asked again, but still spoke in a quiet voice. Not understanding my attempt to be discreet, the cashier responded, "I can't hear you, say it again." At this point, I felt like my cover was blown, so in a more normal tone, I told the cashier the man in front followed me from outside and won't leave me alone. I explained my car was parked in the lot behind the store and I didn't feel comfortable going to my car, and the cashier said okay. The cash wrap area was an enclosed square-shaped counter to maintain distance between the staff and the customers. The cashier walked to the front by where the man was, and from behind the counter told the man to leave. He then came up and reassured me that he told the man to go away, though the man did not, in fact, go away. He continued to stay there. Given that I didn't want him to follow me to my car, I stayed in the store and pretended that I was still shopping, even though I had already found what I came for. I would occasionally glance to the front to see if the man was still there, and he was. And I kept going up to the cashier explaining that the man hadn't left, so he went back up to the front to talk to him. I heard the cashier say, "All right, enough already, leave the store." And while he was doing this, I went to the far back end of the store to remain out of sight. And by the time I circled back to the cashier, I noticed the man was no longer there. The cashier said that he repeatedly and more assertively told the man to leave. He said the man claimed that he didn't understand English. The cashier then pulled a baton that he kept under the counter for protection and held it over his head and asked the man, "Do you understand this?" To which the man finally left the store. I made my purchase but was still worried about walking to my car, even though I was parked in one of the first spaces near the driveway entrance. The cashier pointed at a small TV behind him that had 4 angles of CCTV footage, and he assured me that the man was gone and told me to come back into the store if I saw him again. He also said he would watch as I walked to my car. Even though I would have felt more comfortable if he had walked me to my car, I understood that he was by himself and couldn't leave the store unattended with customers. And after making my purchase, I sped walk to my car, and I always have my keys ready when walking to my car, so I promptly pressed unlock on my car remote, got in, placed my bag of purchases on the passenger seat, and proceeded to start the car. Once my car turned on, I took off the emergency brake, put the car in reverse, and while putting on my seatbelt, I looked in my side view mirror to back out. It was at this point that I saw that same man in the mirror, full-on speed walking right toward my driver's side door. You see, I was driving in a Accord at the time, and that model automatically locks the doors when you take the car out of park. And as soon as I saw him, I hit the gas and violently pulled out of the parking space. I pulled out so fast that it startled him, stopping him dead in his tracks, and he was now standing right next to my driver's side door as I continued to pull out. I gave him the most serious, dead stare I could because I know most predators feed off the fear of their victims. The stare must have worked. As soon as he saw me pulling out while staring at him, he turned his head back toward the driveway entrance and proceeded to walk back to where he had been standing. He had a look of defeat on his face. My face, however, was overcome with relief. I pulled out of the parking lot and took myself back home. And I felt a bit ashamed for being out so late by myself, and I did tell my boyfriend about the incident when he came home at 6 a.m. He also agreed that going out that late alone wasn't the smartest decision, and I'm no longer with that person, but I still live in the same town, though I never leave my home for anything past 9 o'clock anymore. While the town I live in isn't the most dangerous, there are still enough crimes that occur here that it's also not considered the safest. This story takes place in November of 2017, and I was 18. I'm a very short girl, only about 4'10", and I get anxious when someone even looks at me in a way that suggests they might not like me. So needless to say, I'm incredibly non-confrontational. My friend and I were out shopping. It was something we'd do maybe every few months just to bond since we didn't have much time to hang out due to college. And she's just like me. Barely scraping 5'1" and very non-confrontational. It's probably why we became friends. On every shopping trip we would find ourselves in Ann Summers. We're both overly endowed and struggled to find bras anywhere, and Ann Summers always had great sales, so we grabbed the cheap bras while we could. This shopping trip wasn't any different. We browsed shops until we got to Ann Summers, but that's when things took a bit of a turn. I'd barely stepped foot into the shop when a woman with some sort of Slavic accent stopped me, and her finger jammed into my chest. "Spit the gum out," she demanded. Assuming that she was an employee, I gave a very sheepish, "I'm really sorry," and ran out of the shop to spit the gum out and throw it away. When I went back in, I realized that this woman was not an employee. She was a customer who was browsing and happened to be near the door when my friend and I entered the shop. It should have been obvious to me at the time. No salesperson would ever behave like that, not one that wanted to keep their job anyways. But I kept my head down when I walked past her, holding my breath in hopes that she wouldn't notice me again, and she didn't, and I thought I was in the clear. My friend and I browsed the shop, trying to avoid the woman, but the shop wasn't very big, probably only 15 feet by 18 feet, so eventually I ended up at the sales stand by the door where she had been stood. I tried to keep my distance while browsing. I was looking at the price tags but realized that I didn't know what the discount was, so I leaned over slightly to check the discount sign. It's important that I note that this woman had a pushchair, which is a stroller for the Americans, and you'd think that she'd maybe had a child in this pushchair. But no, it was full of plastic carrier bags. I didn't look too much at it, but I could tell that everything in there was double bagged and tied shut. Whatever was in those bags, she wanted to protect. This sense of protection became very relevant because when I leaned over to look at the discount sign, I was leaning slightly closer to her pushchair. I was still about 3 feet away from it, but apparently was too close. The woman was on the other side of the chair, but the moment she saw me, she ran around to it where I was stood. She hits me in the face. It was somewhere between a slap and a punch, and I couldn't quite tell because I was in shock. All I knew is that it hurt. "Watch the personal space," she hissed in my ear, and I apologized to her. This woman just hit me and I apologized to her. I regret it now, but at the time I didn't want to provoke her any further, not that I knew what I did to provoke her in the first place. And in my shock, I turned around and ran to the back area, grabbing my friend's hand and pulling her with me. The back area was separated by a tiny wall that only stretched halfway across the shop since they stored the adult toys there and wanted to keep them out of sight of the general public. I stood there holding my friend's hand and shaking as I whispered, "She just hit me," to my friend, and we stood there for a good minute in silence, and my friend was positioned in a way that she could see the rest of the store while I hid behind the wall. "She's gone," my friend told me, and I let out a breath that I didn't even know that I was holding. "Can we stay here for a while?" I asked my friend, worried that the woman would be outside waiting for me. The front of the store was open, but she could have easily just been a couple of feet down the road and out of sight, waiting for me to leave. My friend agreed and we slowly browsed the shop again. About 5 minutes later, we got to the counter to check out, and the girl working the counter looked outside and then back at us. That woman's been in here for 30 minutes. I didn't know what to do." She told the two of us. "What did she say to you?" "She told me to spit out my gum when we first came in, and then she hit me because I was too close to her." "She hit you?" The worker was wide-eyed. "If I'd have known that, I would have called security. I'm so sorry." I smiled and shrugged. "It's fine." It wasn't really fine, but it wasn't the worker's fault. She didn't look much older than I did, and I wouldn't have known what to do in that situation either. And still shaken up, my friend and I made our way out of the store. I looked around but didn't see the woman. "Can we just go home now?" I asked my friend. We hadn't finished browsing all the shops, but I was so paranoid that we bumped into that insane woman again. She agreed and we got the bus home. And when I got home, my parents encouraged me to report the incident to the police, and I called the non-emergency line, and their answer was basically, "Well, what do you expect us to do about it?" And unless I went back to the Ann Summers and requested the security footage, which I wasn't sure if they actually had, they wouldn't do anything. It's been just over 3 years, and now I'm sure that that woman was likely to have been homeless and/or on drugs. It's the only explanation I can think of for the carrier bags and her protectiveness. It was either everything she owned, or drugs, or maybe even both. This happened to me many years ago. I am 38 now, and I believe this took place when I was 14 or 15. My family, consisting of myself, my mother, and my brother, who is 6 years my junior, were in the process of moving down the road sometime in the near future and had been fixing the new place up so it was move-in ready for us. We had enlisted some help from some extended family, mainly my mother's cousin and her adult sons and their wives, to help paint our bedrooms. During one of these days of hard work, we collectively decided that we all wanted Slurpees from a nearby 7-Eleven store. And for those that don't know, a Slurpee is a frozen drink, usually soda flavors, dispensed from a machine with a handle that you push down or pull up on. The cups come with a clear dome lid and a long straw with a spoon on the end. And maybe it's just me, but the spoon is pretty useless. The best part is, since you get to prepare it yourself, you can mix any of the dozen or so flavors yourself in any order you'd like. So one of my older cousins and I decided to head out to get the drinks while the others continued to work in the house. The drive there and the preparing of the frozen beverages were both uneventful within themselves, but what I do remember is walking back outside and hearing a woman screaming something like, "Help me," to my left. I turned my head only to witness a middle-aged man wrestling the keys away from an older woman. She was maybe in her 60s. I froze and just watched the scene play out in front of me. The man did manage to snatch the keys away from the lady and hopped inside her car, backing it up and taking off with it. The problem was, the lady had somehow fallen and landed with her legs under the car, so when he backed up over her. The police were called, of course, and my cousin and I stayed to give our statements, and I managed to memorize the license plate to the stolen car, which came in handy when the lady was so in shock she couldn't remember it herself. I was always told growing up to get the plate number if there was ever an emergency involving a car, and so I did just that. I remember hearing later that the car was found about 30 miles or about 48 kilometers away from where it was stolen. I'm not sure what happened to the lady, the man, or the car, and since this was the early 2000s, I highly doubt that there would be any information online this long after. The 7-Eleven has since closed and become a few different businesses, the most current being a cell phone store, but anytime I venture past that place, I always think back to that event that I witnessed many years ago. Back in July of 2018, myself and my 3 best friends decided to go on vacation to Barcelona. The 4 of us, all girls, were 18 at the time and had just finished our freshman year of college. For context, we had planned this trip for several months, but being the lazy asses that we were, we took our time before booking our flights and Airbnb. We eventually started our search in May, and if you've ever been to Barcelona, you might know that's already pretty late if you want to find an affordable and well-located summer accommodation. We ended up scrolling through several websites for days as everything was way out of our budget. One of my friends finally found a very decent studio located near the Rambles, a very touristy neighborhood. The condo was actually located on a narrow street perpendicular to the main Rambla. You had to walk about 500 meters or 0.3 miles to reach the sketchier end of the street where the flat was. It didn't really bother us since the building was pretty secure. You had to open the first front door, which led to the street, then you had to take the stairs to the second floor where there was a second door requiring another key. The second door led to 3 condos, so we had a third and final key to our personal flat. And this door had no outside handle, meaning that if we left without our keys, we'd be locked out. Additionally, the balcony door also had no outside handle. You could only open it from the inside. This might seem like a lot of details, but it is important for what comes next. The day we checked in, we were pretty excited despite being utterly exhausted. We had been traveling for 15 hours at that point, so we decided to smoke a cigarette on the balcony. The balcony next to ours belonged to our next-door neighbors, a group of Italian boys that we met at that very moment. They had been pretty loud throughout our stay, but we never thought too much of it. As for the layout of our condo, the front door led directly into the main room where 2 of my friends were sleeping. The bed was on the left, and at the end of the room was the living room, which also functioned as a kitchen and a bedroom. The sofa was a foldable, where my 3rd friend and I were sleeping. We were there for 5 nights. As the young women that we were, our daily routine was pretty consistent. We would go clubbing every night, get home at around 4 a.m., pass out in our beds, and wake up at 11. We'd visit the city until 7 p.m., then get ready to repeat the cycle. Our first 3 nights were awesome. We had some male friends who were also staying in Barcelona, so we'd meet up with them and it was a lot of fun. But the 4th night was creepy. We got home at 4 a.m., messed around with each other for another hour, and fell asleep by 5. Around 7:30, my friend, who was sleeping with me in the living room and suffers from sleep paralysis, woke up feeling something tickling her ankle. She opened her eyes and saw something crouching at the end of the bed, his hand on her ankle, as if he were looking for something under the bed. At that moment, she was convinced that she was experiencing sleep paralysis again, but the fear made her sit up in bed and shout, "What the F?" which rarely happens with sleep paralysis, as obviously your muscles are usually numb. And her shouting woke me up, and I saw the guy. Standing at the end of the bed and still half asleep, I whispered, "Edward?" I think I had been dreaming about a friend of mine and confused this guy with him, and the guy got startled, suddenly stood up, stared at us, and then just tiptoed away, muttering, "Oops, oops, oops." He walked past the other bed where my friends were still dead asleep and exited through the front door. My friend and I stayed up for a long time talking about what had just happened, and eventually we woke the other girls and told them the story. And we never figured out how this guy broke into our flat. He didn't steal anything, even though we had left our credit cards, IDs, and phones and cash openly displayed on that table. And the only thing was that we didn't lock the front door that night. But it was closed, meaning that normally no one should have been able to open it since it has no handle, unless someone had a key. We chose not to talk to the police about it because we feared they'd blame us for not locking the door properly. We also didn't inform the landlord for the same reason, but also because we didn't want to ruin our last day there. We tried contacting our neighbors, those Italian guys, and went to their flat and knocked, but they never answered the door. Looking back, we definitely should have done something about it, and we shouldn't have stayed there for another minute. But we were too young, I guess. We could never figure out what that guy wanted or what he was looking for touching our ankle like that. None of it made any sense. Why would someone enter an apartment uninvited at 7:30 a.m. while the occupants were asleep just to look for something under the bed? Well, I guess we'll never know. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and new big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Mr. Wroblewski voted for Trump! We gotta get out of here!